In the last chapter, we went over all the different types of ideologies that were being kind of like flirted with and experimented with across different groups, how popular some were, how unpopular they were, different strains of thought that came from each, and how a lot of these, even though I think one of the points that the author wanted to make here was that one thing that I actually really appreciate, I don't know if I'm in the Matrix or I'm the main character in the world, or if I've just stumbled onto thoughts that a lot of other people have thought about because it's obvious and true, is I like that the author in the prologue, I was going to say the preamble, the prologue of this book stressed that history is not inevitable, and there were plenty of times where things could have gone a different way, but they didn't. So he brings up in here, like, well, there's a lot of times where it could have been that Germany was a crazy Nazi country, or they could have become crazy anti-Semitic, but they didn't for a variety of reasons. So that was the last chapter. Okay. Across the border, in German-speaking Austria, another version of radical anti-Semitism was provided by Georg Ritter von Schonerer, the son of a railway engineer who had been given a title of nobility by the Habsburg Emperor as a reward for his services to the state. The year after its defeat by Prussia in 1866, the Habsburg monarchy had restructured itself into two equal halves, Austria and Hungary, bound together by the person of the emperor, Franz Joseph, and his central administration in Vienna. That administration was staffed overwhelmingly by German speakers, and the 6 million or so Austrian Germans reconciled themselves to their expulsion from the German Confederation by identifying strongly with the Habsburgs and regarding themselves as the empire's ruling group. But Schonerer was not satisfied with this. "If only we belonged to the German Empire," he exclaimed in the Austrian parliament in 1878. A radical, improving landlord, Schonerer was a proponent of universal manhood suffrage, the complete secularization of education, the nationalization of the railways, a reflection perhaps of his father's occupation, and state support for small farmers and artisans. He regarded the Hungarians and the other nationalities in the Habsburg monarchy as brakes on the progress of the Germans, who would, he thought, do far better economically and socially in a union with the German Reich. Okay. As time went on, Schonerer's belief in German racial superiority became allied to an increasingly intense form of anti-Semitism. He augmented his 11-point German nationalist Linz program of 1879 with a 12th point in 1885 demanding the removal of Jewish influence from all sections of public life as a precondition for the reforms he wanted to achieve. Schonerer's presence in the Austrian parliament allowed him to campaign against the influence of Jews in, for example, railway companies, and gave him immunity from prosecution when he used extravagant language to condemn them. He founded a series of organizations to propagate his views, and one of them, the Pan-German Association, succeeded in getting 21 deputies elected to the parliament in 1901. It soon broke up amid bitter personal quarrels among the leadership. But its example spawned other anti-Semitic organizations as well. Its constant harping upon the supposedly evil influence of the Jews made it easier for a cynical communal politician, such as the Christian social conservative Karl Lueger, to use anti-Semitic demagogy to win enough support to install him as mayor of Vienna on behalf of the rising right-wing Christian Social Party in 1897. Lueger held this position for the next decade, stamping his influence indelibly on the city through a mixture of rabble-rousing populism and imaginative, socially progressive municipal reform. Schonerer never enjoyed this kind of popular support, but where Lueger's anti-Semitism, though influential, was essentially opportunistic, "I decide who's a Yid," he once famously said. I'm guessing Yid is like a slur for a Jew because they spoke Yiddish back then, I think. He once famously said, when criticized for dining with influential Jews in Vienna, Schonerer's was visceral and unyielding. He proclaimed anti-Semitism, indeed, the greatest achievement of the century. As time went on, his ideas became even more extreme. Describing himself as a pagan, Schonerer spearheaded an anti-Catholic movement under the slogan "Away from Rome" and coined the pseudo-medieval greeting "Hail, Hail," using it in Parliament to the general outrage of the deputies in 1902 when he ended a speech by declaring his allegiance to the German rather than the Austrian royal family, up with and hail to the Hohenzollerns, Christ. Hohenzollerns. Schoner's followers called him the leader, Führer, another term which his movement probably introduced into the political vocabulary of the far right. Sure, that sounds like a why not? He proposed to rename annual festivals and the months of the year by Germanic titles such as Yulefest for Christmas and Haymoon for June. Even more eccentric was his proposal for a new calendar dating from the defeat of a Roman army by the Germanic Cimbri at the Battle of Noria in 118 BC. Schoner actually held a not very successful festival to inaugurate the new millennium with the year 2001 and N, the initial standing for Nach Noria, after Noria. Good one. And then he renamed it to the Gulf of Germany. Schoner was an uncompromising racial anti-Semite. Religion's all the same. It's race that is to blame was one of his typically catchy slogans. His extremism got him in trouble with the authorities on more than one occasion, notably in 1888, when a false newspaper report of the death of Kaiser Wilhelm I caused him to storm into the guilty newspaper's offices and physically attack members of its staff. After he had publicly toasted, is it Wilhelm or Wilhelm? It's Wilhelm, right? After he had publicly toasted Wilhelm as our glorious emperor, the outraged Habsburg emperor, Franz Joseph, deprived him of his noble title, while the parliament waived his immunity so that he could serve a 4-month term in jail. This did not prevent him from declaring after his release that he longed for the day when a German army would march into Austria and destroy it. Wait, what? So what did the German Empire or whatever look like prior to, prior to the First World War? Holy fuck. It had like half of modern day Poland. It's called Prussia, not Poland. Okay, so the German Empire is like a confederation of states. Okay. And he was a German-speaking guy, but he was in Austria, but he liked the German monarch more than the Austrian monarch because he was a German speaker plus anti-Semitic. Okay. German monarch were the Habsburgs, and the Austrian one was the Franz Joseph. Is that correct? Do I have these names down? There's a lot of fucking information. The Austrians are the Habsburgs. Oh, inverse. Habsburgs were the Austrians. The German royal family was the Hohenzollerns. Jesus. Okay. These fucking names, bro. Hohenzollerns were the German monarchs. Okay. All right. This did not prevent him from declaring after his release that he longed for the day when a German army would march into Austria and destroy it. Such extremism meant that Schoner never really left the fringes of politics. In 1907, indeed, he failed to secure re-election to the Austrian parliament, and the number of deputies who followed his line dwindled to 3. Schoner was perhaps more interested in spreading ideas than in winning power, but in this guise, he was to have a considerable influence on Nazism later on. Anti-Semitism in Austria was far from being a separate phenomenon from its German counterpart. The common language and common culture with Germany, and the fact that Austria had been part of the Holy Roman Reich of the German nation for over 1,000 years, and then of the German Confederation until its rude expulsion by Bismarck in 1866, meant that intellectual and political influences crossed the border without too much difficulty. Schoner, for example, was a self-confessed disciple of the German anti-Semite Eugen Dühring. Citizens of the German Reich, particularly of the Catholic South, who looked to Vienna for inspiration, could not help but notice Luger's combination of social reform, Catholic allegiance, and anti-Semitic rhetoric. Schoner's racial definition of the Jews, his cult of the Aryan myth, his avowed paganism and distaste for Christianity, his belief in the superiority of the Germans, and his contempt for other races, especially the Slavs, were in part shared by the more extreme anti-Semites within the German Empire. None of his ideas could be seen as alien. They were essentially part of the same extremist current of thought. Schoner's pan-Germanism doomed him to failure while the Habsburg monarchy continued to exist. But if it should ever fall, then its German-speaking minorities would be confronted in an acute form with the question of whether they wanted to join the German Reich or form a separate state on their own. In this eventuality, pan-Germanism would come into its own. In the German Reich itself, the accession of Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1888 quickly led to a serious weakening of Bismarck's position as Reich Chancellor. When the two differed over the renewal or the lapsing of the anti-socialist law, so the Kaiser is the actual leader guy, but the Reich Chancellor was basically his deputy, and he's the guy that basically did everything for the Kaiser, assuming the Kaiser and him agreed, basically, right? And so Bismarck was the Reich Chancellor, so second in command, basically, right? Yeah, okay. With its manifold, okay. When the two differed over the renewal or the lapsing of the anti-socialist law, with its manifold restrictions on civil liberties, Bismarck was forced to resign. The lapsing of the law gave rise to a whole range of new social and political movements in all parts of the political spectrum. New, colorful figures appeared on the political scene, contrasting with the drabness of Bismarck's immediate successors as Chancellor, Caprivi and Hohenlohe. Christ. Hohenlohe. Among them was one at least who attracted admiration as precisely the kind of hero the German nationalists were looking for. Right to bear arms, lol, Karl Peters was a classic colonial adventurer of the late 19th century whose exploits quickly became the stuff of legend. When Bismarck reluctantly acquired nominal German colonies in 1884, Peters set out to turn his paper conquests into real ones. On reaching the East African coast, he organized an expedition and departed for the interior, where he concluded a number of treaties with indigenous rulers. Characteristically, he had neglected to consult the German government about this, and Bismarck repudiated the treaties when he heard about them. Peters got into further trouble when it was revealed that he had not only been maltreating his bearers, but had also had sexual relations with African women. Reports of his misdemeanors shocked bourgeois opinion. But this did not deter Peters from pursuing his quest to found a great German empire in Africa. Peters' fertile imagination and restless spirit led him to found a variety of organizations, including a Society for German Colonization in 1884, which merged with a like-minded group in 1887 to form the German Colonial Society. Such was Peters' prominence, combined with the influence of his supporters, that Bismarck felt obliged to recognize his East African venture and declare a German protectorate over the areas he had explored, the first step in the creation of the German colony of Tanganyika. Okay. In 1890, however, Bismarck's successor, Leo von Caprivi, agreed to surrender some of the territory Peters had claimed, most notably the island of Zanzibar, to the British in return for their cession to Germany of the North Sea island of Heligoland. Outraged, Peters chaired a meeting organized early in 1891 by a group of nationalists, including the young civil servant Alfred Hugenberg, who was later to play a fateful role in the rise and triumph of Nazism. Okay, well then let's remember this dude. They founded a General German League, renamed the Pan-German League, in 1894. The aim of the new organization was to push vigorously for German expansion abroad and the Germanization of national minorities at home. In this, it was joined in 1894 by the Society for the Eastern Marches. This group, which had relatively close ties with the government compared to those enjoyed by the Pan-Germans, devoted itself to the destruction of Polish identity in Germany's eastern provinces. Another, not dissimilar organization, founded in 1881 in response to struggles over official languages and the Habsburg monarchy, was the German School Association, which sought to preserve the German language in areas of German settlement outside the boundaries of the Reich. It was later renamed the... Okay, wait, hold on. So the German Reich is the province or state that's part of a larger thing, which is the German Empire. The German Reich... And then in Prussia is another province or state in the German Empire, and that's what the Habsburg monarchy is a part of, right? Is this correct? No, Reich means empire. Germany's when it okay, I'm sorry. When it says Germany's eastern provinces, does this refers to the German Empire? Prussia is the ruling state, yes, of the empire. Okay. Habsburgs rule the Austrian Empire. The confusion is the Holy Roman Reich. Wait, how is there an Austrian Empire if there's also a German Empire? Or are these two different empires? They're two totally different empires. Okay. Gotcha. Wait, two different empires by two different German states. Oh, but German, not like part of the Empire of Germany. They're two different empires. Okay. Why don't they fucking do names? How cringe. Okay. German, not part of Germany. Okay. Another not dissimilar organization founded in 1881 in response to struggles over official languages in the Habsburg monarchy. So Habsburg is the monarchy that rules the Austrian Empire. That's not part of the German Empire, right? Was the German School Association, which sought to preserve the German language in the areas of German settlement outside the boundaries of the Reich, so outside of the German Empire. It was later renamed the Association for Germandom Abroad in recognition of a substantial broadening of its remit to cover all aspects of German culture in the rest of the world. Okay. Why am I being like this? This page is sending you here. Germany and Austria, Hungary. Gotcha. Okay. I guess. This is in the year 1900. Okay. Okay, where was I? More nationalist associations were to follow. The most significant, perhaps, was the Navy League, founded in 1898 with money from the arms manufacturer Krupp, who had an obvious interest in the construction of a big German navy being approved by the Reichstag at the time. And the Reichstag was the parliament of the German Empire, right? Okay. Within a decade, is it still called Reichstag in Germany, or is that like a no-no word now? I'm guessing it's probably not. They probably just call it the parliament now, huh? Or does Reichstag just mean parliament? Do they still call it that? It is called that? Yes, yes. The building is called that. The modern one is the Bundestag. Cringe. Okay. Within a decade, it was dwarfing the other nationalist groups, with a membership totaling well over 300,000 if affiliated organizations were counted as well. By contrast, the other nationalist pressure groups were seldom able to exceed a membership of around 50,000, and the Pan-Germans seemed to be permanently stuck below the 20,000 mark. Losers. Most of these pressure groups, but all of them were still doing Bernie math for how they could eventually win the elections. Most of these pressure groups were run by professional agitators like August Keim, an army officer whose journalistic activities had caused him promotion problems. Such men were prominent in a number of nationalist associations and often provided their radical driving force. Keim, for example, was a leading figure in both the Navy League and the Defense League and founded other, less well-known associations, such as the German League and the Prevention of the Emancipation of Women. Jesus. Or the German League for the Prevention of the Emancipation of Women. Which aimed to send women back to the home to bear more children for the Reich. Alongside such marginal men were ranged disgruntled notables seeking a new outlet for their political drive in an increasingly democratic world, where the deference to the propertied and the educated that had sustained the electoral fortunes of the national liberals and other parties further to the right from the 1860s to the 1880s no longer functioned effectively. Many of these agitators had achieved their status by working hard to get a university degree and then moving up slowly through the ranks of the less fashionable parts of the civil service. Here, too, a degree of social anxiety was an important driving force. Identification, perhaps over-identification, with the German nation gave all the leading figures in the nationalist associations, whatever their background, a sense of pride and belonging and an object for commitment and mobilization. The membership of these various organizations also frequently overlapped, and it was far from unusual for two or more of them to make common cause in a particular political fight, despite their frequent personal and political rivalries. Alongside the specific aims that each organization followed, and irrespective of the frequent internal rows which plagued them, the nationalist associations generally agreed that Bismarck's work of building the German nation was woefully incomplete and urgently needed to be pushed to its conclusion. Increasingly, too, they began to think that the Reich leadership was failing to do its duty in this respect. The nationalists' beliefs were laid bare in a particularly dramatic way in 1912, when the chairman of the Pan-German League, the lawyer Heinrich Class, writing under a pseudonym, published a manifesto with the arresting title, "If I Were the Kaiser." He was not modest in his aims. If he had the power wielded by Wilhelm II, Class let it be known, he would deal first of all with the internal enemies of the Reich, the Social Democrats and the Jews. The Social Democratic victory in the Reichstag elections earlier in the year was, he thundered, the result of a Jewish conspiracy to undermine the nation. The Jews were subverting German art, destroying German creativity, corrupting the German masses. If he were Kaiser, Class wrote, they would immediately lose their civil rights and be classified as aliens. The Social Democrats would be banned, and their leading officials, parliamentary deputies, newspaper editors, and union secretaries would be expelled from Germany. Now, I think in this context, when they say Social Democrats, these people were actually, socialist leaning. I don't think they were just liberals. Or maybe they still had flavors of liberalism, but they were also pushing in a socialist direction. But I believe so. They were reform socialists. Okay. The Reichstag suffrage would be restructured so as to give more voting power to the educated and the propertied, and only the best men would be allowed to bear office. National rallies and patriotic festivals would rally the mass of the people to the national cause. Internal pacification, the nationalists argued, would include the suppression of minority cultures, such as that of the Poles in the eastern provinces of Prussia, driving them from their landholdings, banning the use of their language, and using force if necessary to bring the supposedly inferior and uncivilized Slavs to heel. Okay, hold on. So when they say Prussia, is Prussia the Kingdom of Austria? Or is Prussia in the German Empire? No. Okay, Prussia is in the German Empire. Prussia means Poland-ish. Okay, Prussia is the east part of the German Empire. Is a state that rules the German Empire. The strongest province in the German Empire. Okay. Somebody linked me a map. West Prussia and East Prussia. Is that altogether considered Prussia, or are they two states, or? Okay. Led by Class, the Pan-Germans and their allies advocated a massive arms buildup, greater even than that already launched by the Navy laws from 1898 onwards. This would be followed by a war in which Germany would conquer Europe and annex German-speaking areas such as Switzerland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Austria. They brushed aside any consideration for the other nationalities who inhabited these areas and passed over the linguistic and cultural differences that made it unlikely that even Flemish separatists in Belgium, let alone other kinds of political dissident, would support them. They added on Romania for strategic reasons, and they noted that the Belgian and Dutch overseas possessions, including, for example, the Congo, would provide the basis for a massive new colonial empire that would far outweigh its British counterpart. Borrowing eclectically from Nietzsche, Langben, Darwin, Treitschke, and other writers, and frequently vulgarizing their ideas in the process, wrenching them out of context, or simplifying them to the point of unrecognizability, the Pan-Germans and their nationalist allies founded their ideology on a worldview that had struggle, conflict, Aryan ethnic superiority, anti-Semitism, and the will to power as its core beliefs. However, at the same time as they harbored these almost limitless ambitions for German world domination, the Pan-German League and other nationalist associations also sounded a strong note of alarm, even despondency, about Germany's current state and future prospects. The German people, they believed, were surrounded by enemies, from the Slavs and Latins encircling Germany from without, to the Jews, Jesuits, socialists, and sundry subversive agitators and conspirators undermining it from within. Pan-German racism was expressed in the linguistic usage through which they reduced every nation to a simple, uniformly acting racial entity. Germandom, Slavdom, Anglo-Saxondom, or Judom. Other races were outbreeding the Germans and threatening to flood them, or, like the French, they were declining and therefore exerting a corrupting influence through their decadence. The extreme nationalists portrayed themselves as voices in the wilderness. Unless they were heard, it would be too late. Desperate peril demanded desperate remedies. Only by a return to the racial roots of the German nation and the peasantry, the self-employed artisan and small businessman, and the traditional nuclear family could the situation be rescued. The big cities were sinks of un-German immorality and disorder. Strong measures were needed to restore order, decency, and a properly German concept of culture. A new Bismarck was needed, tough, ruthless, unafraid to pursue aggressive policies at home and abroad if the nation was to be saved. As time went on, the nationalist associations became more vocal in their criticism of the German government for what they regarded as its weakness at home and abroad. Jolted into radical action by the Social Democratic election victory of 1912, following on what they regarded as the humiliating outcome for Germany of an international crisis over Morocco the previous year, the usually quarrelsome nationalist associations joined forces in support for the newly founded Defense League, which aimed to do for the Army what the Navy League had done for the fleet. The new organization was far more independent from the government than the Navy League was. It shared in full the views of the Pan-Germans, and it achieved a membership of 90,000 within 2 years of its foundation in 1912, giving the Pan-Germans the kind of mass base they had always failed to create for themselves. Meanwhile, the Pan-Germans launched a joint campaign with the colonial society to persuade the government to stop recognizing the legal validity of marriages between German settlers and black Africans in the colonies. Prominent members of the Conservative Party began to work with the Pan-Germans. In August of 1913, the Agrarian League, a huge pressure group of large and small landowners with very close ties to the Conservatives, joined with the Central Association of German Industrialists and the National Organization of Artisans and Handicraftsmen to form the Cartel of Productive Estates. Not only did the cartel have a membership running into the millions, it also incorporated many of the central aims and beliefs of the Pan-Germans, including the sidelining or elimination of the Reichstag, the suppression of the Social Democrats, and the pursuit of an aggressive foreign policy, up to and including the launching of a major war of conquest. These extreme nationalist pressure groups were not the product of any kind of manipulative strategy by Wilhelmine elites. They were a genuinely populist movement of political mobilization from below. but they had no constituency at all in the working class. The furthest their reservoir of support went down the social scale was to white-collar workers and clerks, one of whose trade unions, the virulently anti-Semitic German National Commercial Employees Union, railed against the Jewish business interests which they supposed were keeping their members' wages down, and attacked the intrusion of women into secretarial and administrative positions as the product of Jewish attempts to destroy the German family. Yet, the new prominence of the nationalist associations from 1912 onwards put huge pressure on the German government. It became even greater as the Pan-Germans won new friends in the right-wing press. One of the Pan-German supporters, the retired General Konstantin von Gebsattel, impressed by If I Were the Kaiser, composed a lengthy memorandum calling for a fight against Jewish machinations and rabble-rousing by social democratic leaders. A Reich that was not parliamentarian, a Kaiser who really ruled, instead of being just a figurehead, and conducted an aggressive foreign policy with an armored fist, and a franchise which restricted the influence of the masses to a minimum. In the proposals put forward in the memo, Jews were to be treated as aliens, barred from acquiring land, and deprived of their property if they immigrated. They were to be excluded from state-run professions such as the civil service, the law, the universities, and the army. Baptism, of course, made no difference to the fact that someone was a Jew in Gebsattel's eyes. Anyone with more than a quarter of Jewish blood in his or her veins was to be treated as a Jew and not a German. The Jewish press was to be closed down. All of this was necessary because, he said, the whole life of Germany was dominated by the Jewish spirit, which was superficial, negative, destructively critical, and materialistic. It was time for the true German spirit to reemerge. Deep, positive, and idealistic. All this was to be brought about by an effective coup d'etat from above, secured by the declaration of a military state of siege and the introduction of martial law. Gebsattel and his friend, the pan-German leader Heinrich Class, regarded the memorandum as moderate in tone. The alleged moderation had a reason. The idea was to send it to Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm, the heir to the throne, who is known for his sympathies with the nationalist cause. He, in turn, forwarded it with enthusiasm to his father and to the man currently holding the office of state once occupied by Bismarck, Reich Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg. Okay. Wait, what's the name of the German monarch? You said it was what was that? How did you type that? Hohenzollern. Why isn't that their last names then? Why is Wilhelm? How does Hohenzollern or whatever the fuck relate to Wilhelm? It is their dynasty. So what is Wilhelm? Is that just a fucking middle name? Kings always use their first name, Queen Elizabeth. So Friedrich Wilhelm, is that just two first names? That's so cringe. Okay, Jesus Christ. Okay. You can turn forward? Okay. Okay. Bethmann and the Kaiser courteously but firmly rejected Gebsattel's idea, regarding them as impractical and indeed dangerous to the stability of the monarchy. The Reich Chancellor admitted that the Jewish question was an area in which there were great dangers for Germany's further development, but, he went on, Gebsattel's draconian solutions could not be taken seriously. The Kaiser poured more cold water on the proposals by warning his son that Gebsattel was a weird enthusiast whose ideas were often downright childish. Still, he too conceded that even if it were economically inadvisable to expel the Jews from Germany, it was important to exclude the Jewish influence from the army and the administration, and as far as possible to limit it in all the activities of art and literature. In the press, too, he considered, Jewdom has found its most dangerous happy hunting ground through a general restriction of press freedom as advocated by Gebsattel would, he thought, be counterproductive, as advocated by... Okay, let me read that again, I'm sorry. In the press, too, he considered, Judaism has found its most dangerous, happy hunting ground through a general, though a general restriction. Holy fuck, I'm sorry, this sentence. Okay, one more time. In the press, too, he considered, Judaism has found its most dangerous, happy hunting ground. Though a general restriction of press freedom as advocated by Gepsattel would, he thought, be counterproductive. Anti-Semitic stereotypes had thus penetrated to the highest levels of the state, reinforced in the Kaiser's case by his own reading of Houston Stewart Chamberlain's The Foundations of the 19th Century, which he praised as a wake-up call to the German nation. Moreover, wait, is that relation, the same Chamberlain that we all talk about when we talk about Chamberlain? Or is that like Neville Chamberlain? Or am I making that name up? Or is it Neville Churchill? I don't, fuck these names. Or is it Neville Chamberlain? No, this is a completely different guy. British-German philosopher. Oh, okay. No relation to Neville. No, Neville Churchill. No, it's Neville Chamberlain. Fuck you guys. Stop! Okay. Moreover, as the Pan-Germans, undeterred, stepped up their criticism of the Chancellor, both in public and behind the scenes, Bethmann felt increasingly constrained to adopt a tough line in his foreign policy, with fateful results in the crisis that led to the outbreak of the First World War in August of 1914. Oh my God, is that why that one book is called The Guns of August? Because that's the month that it started in? Okay. Like other European nations, Germany went into the First World War in an optimistic mood, fully expecting to win, most probably in a relatively short space of time. Military men, like the war minister, Erich von Falkenhayn, expected a longer conflict and even feared that Germany might eventually be defeated. But their expert view did not communicate itself to the masses, or indeed to many of the politicians in whose hands Germany's destiny lay. The mood of invincibility was buoyed up by the massive growth of the German economy over the previous decades and fired on by the stunning victories of the German army in 1914 to 1915 on the Eastern Front. An early Russian invasion of East Prussia led the chief of the German general staff to appoint a retired general, Paul von Hindenburg. Okay, so Prussia, East Prussia, is the easternmost part of the German Empire, and that's the state from which the German Empire is ruled. Correct, right? Yes. Somebody say yes. Yeah, okay. The German, okay. An early Russian invasion of East Prussia led the chief of the German general staff to appoint a retired general, Paul von Hindenburg, born in 1847, and a veteran of the War of 1870 to 1871, to take over the campaign with the aid of his chief of staff, Erich Ludendorff, a technical expert and military engineer of non-noble origins, who had won a reputation for himself with the attack on Liège at the beginning of the war. The two generals enticed the invading Russian armies into a trap and annihilated them, following this with a string of further victories. By the end of September 1915, the Germans had conquered Poland, inflicted huge losses on the Russian armies, and driven them back over 250 miles from the positions they had occupied the previous year. So is Poland a real place at this point, or is he just talking about like where modern-day Poland is? Or was Poland further to the east, or? No, he's just talking about where the modern-day borders are. Okay. Oh, thanks. German Reich, 1914. Okay, I have a Kindle version of this book. We can't do this in color or with higher fucking definition. To be annexed directly by Germany as planned officially, the maximum extent. Okay, I see that. And then Poland to be attached to the German Reich as a tributary state. Additional annexation demanded by the Pan-German League. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. And then the German military advanced all the way east through where Ukraine was. I'm sorry. I was going to say where Ukraine was, and then I was going to say, well, I mean, where Ukraine is, but actually it is where Ukraine was, because I guess now some of that is Russian, huh? Jesus. These achievements made the reputation of Hindenburg as a virtually invincible general. A cult of the hero quickly developed around him, and his massive, stolid presence seemed to provide an element of stability amid the changing fortunes of war. But he was, in fact, a man of limited political vision and ability. He acted, in many ways, as a front for his energetic subordinate, Ludendorff, whose ideas about the conduct of the war were far more radical and ruthless than his own. The Paris triumphs in the East contrasted sharply with the stalemate in the West, where, within a few months of the outbreak of the war, some 8 million troops were facing each other along 450 miles of trenches from the North Sea to the Swiss border, unable to penetrate to a meaningful degree into the enemy lines. The soft ground allowed them to construct line after line of deep defensive trenches. Barbed wire entanglements impeded the enemy's advance, and machine gun emplacements all along the line mowed down any troops from the other side that succeeded in getting close enough to be shot at. Both sides threw increasing resources into this futile struggle. By 1916, the strain was beginning to tell. In all the major combatant nations, there was a change of leadership in the middle years of the war, reflecting a perceived need for greater energy and ruthlessness in mobilizing the nation and its resources. In France, Clemenceau came to power. In Britain, Lloyd George. In Germany, characteristically, it was not a radical civilian politician, but the two most successful generals, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who took over the reins of power in 1916. The Hindenburg program attempted to galvanize and reorganize the German economy to bend it to the overriding purpose of winning the war. Run by another middle-class general, Wilhelm Groener, the War Office co-opted the trade unions and civilian politicians in the task of mobilization. But this was anathema to the industrialists and the other generals. Groener was soon dispensed with. Pushing the civilian politicians aside, Hindenburg and Ludendorff established a silent dictatorship in Germany, with military rule behind the scenes, severe curbs on civil liberties, central control of the economy, and the generals calling the shots in the formulation of war aims and foreign policy. All of these developments were to provide significant precedents for the more drastic fate that overtook German democracy and civil freedom less than 2 decades later. Sure, why not? It's pronounced Gunnar unironically. Is it? The turn to a more ruthless prosecution of the war was counterproductive in more than one sense. Ludendorff ordered a systematic economic exploitation of the areas of France, Belgium, and East Central Europe occupied by German troops. The occupied country's memory of this was to cost the Germans dearly at the end of the war. The general's inflexible and ambitious war aims alienated many Germans in the liberal center and on the left. And the decision at the beginning of 1917 to undertake unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic in order to cut off British supplies from the United States only provoked the Americans to enter the war on the Allied side. From 1917, the mobilization of the world's richest economy began to weigh heavily on the Allied side, and by the end of the year, American troops were coming onto the Western Front in ever-increasing numbers. The only really bright spot from the German point of view was the continuing string of military successes in the East. But these too had a price. The relentless military pressure of the German armies and their allies in the East bore fruit early in 1917 in the collapse of the inefficient and unpopular administration of the Russian Tsar Nicholas II and its replacement with a provisional government in the hands of Russian liberals. These proved no more capable than the Tsar, however. It's Tsar, right? However, Tsar and Tsar. Wait, is Tsar pronounced the same way as Tsar? C-Z-A-R and T-S-A-R? Tsar? Tsar, right? Yeah. However, of mobilizing Russia's huge resources for a successful war. With near famine conditions at home, chaos in the administration, and growing defeat and despair at the front, the mood in Moscow and St. Petersburg turned increasingly against the war, and the already precarious legitimacy of the provisional government began to disappear into thin air. The chief beneficiary of this situation was the only political grouping in Russia that had offered consistent opposition to the war from the very beginning, the Bolshevik Party, an extremist, tightly organized, ruthlessly single-minded Marxist group whose leader, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, had argued all along that defeat in war was the quickest way to bring about a revolution. Seizing his chance, he organized a swift coup in the autumn of 1917 that met with little immediate resistance. The October Revolution soon degenerated into bloody chaos. When opponents of the Bolsheviks attempted a counter-coup, the new regime responded with a violent Red Terror. All other parties were suppressed. A centralized dictatorship under Lenin's leadership was established. A newly formed Red Dictatorship under Lenin's leadership... Wait, did I just read that? A newly formed Red Army, led by Leon... Is it Leon or is it Leon? Leon Trotsky, fought a bitter civil war against the Whites, who aimed to reestablish the Tsarist regime. Their efforts could not help the Tsar himself, whom the Bolsheviks quickly put to death, along with his family. The Bolsheviks' political police organization, the Cheka, ruthlessly suppressed the regime's opponents from every part of the political spectrum, from the moderate socialist Mensheviks, the anarchists, and the peasant social revolutionaries on the left, to liberals, conservatives, and czarists on the right. Thousands were tortured, killed, or brutally imprisoned in the first camps in what was to become a vast system of confinement by the 1930s. Lenin's regime eventually triumphed, seeing off the Whites and their supporters and establishing its control over much of the former Tsarist empire. The Bolshevik leader and his successors were moved to construct their version of a communist state and society, with the socialization of the economy representing, in theory at least, common ownership of property, the abolition of religion guaranteeing a secular socialist consciousness, the confiscation of private wealth creating a classless society, and the establishment of democratic centralism and a planned economy giving unprecedented dictatorial powers to the central administration in Moscow. All this, however, was happening in a state and society that Lenin knew to be economically backward and lacking in modern resources. More advanced economies, like that of Germany, had, in his view, more developed social systems in which revolution was even more likely to break out than had been the case in Russia. Indeed, Lenin believed that the Russian Revolution could scarcely survive unless successful revolutions of the same type took place elsewhere as well. So the Bolsheviks formed a communist international, Comintern, to propagate their version of revolution in the rest of the world. In doing so, they could take advantage of the fact that socialist movements in many countries had split over the issues raised by the war. In Germany in particular, the once monolithic Social Democratic Party, which began by supporting the war as a mainly defensive operation against the threat from the East, had been beset by increasing doubts as the scale of the annexations demanded by the government began to become clear. In 1916, the party split into pro-war and anti-war factions. The majority continued, with reservations, to support the war and to propagate moderate reforms rather than wholesale revolution. Amongst the minority of independent social democrats, a few, led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, founded the German Communist Party in December of 1918. They were eventually joined by the mass of the minority supporters in the early 1920s. Hold on, I'm trying to understand this thought process. More advanced economies like that of Germany had, in his view, more developed social systems in which revolution was even more likely to break out than had been the case in Russia. So then Lenin believed that the Russian Revolution could scarcely survive unless successful revolutions of the same type took place elsewhere as well. Why? How do those two thoughts connect? Because if it couldn't even happen in Germany where it should be more likely to happen, then why would it survive in Russia like that? Or... Because, or they just, in general, they'd help each other, I guess. Okay. It would be difficult to exaggerate the fear and terror that these events spread amongst many parts of the population in Western and Central Europe. The middle and upper classes were alarmed by the radical rhetoric of the communists and saw their counterparts in Russia lose their property and disappear into the torture chambers and prison camps of the Cheka. Social Democrats were terrified that if the communists came to power in their own country, they would meet the same fate suffered by the moderate socialist Mensheviks and the peasant-oriented social revolutionaries in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Democrats everywhere were conscious from the outset that communism was intent on suppressing human rights, dismantling representative institutions, and abolishing civil freedoms. Terror led them to believe that communism in their own countries should be stopped at any cost, even by violent means, and through the abrogation of the very civil liberties they were pledged to defend. In the eyes of the right, In the eyes of the right, communism and social democracy amounted to two sides of the same coin, and the one seemed no less a threat than the other. In Hungary, a short-lived communist regime under Bela Kun took place in 1918, tried to abolish the church, and was swiftly overthrown by the monarchists led by Admiral Miklos Horthy. The counter-revolutionary regime proceeded to institute a white terror in which thousands of Bolsheviks and socialists were arrested, brutally maltreated, imprisoned, and killed. Events in Hungary gave Central Europeans, for the first time, a taste of the new levels of political violence and conflict that were to emerge from the tensions created by the war. In Germany itself, the threat of communism still seemed relatively remote at the beginning of 1918. Lenin and the Bolsheviks quickly negotiated a much-needed peace settlement to give themselves the breathing space they required to consolidate their newly won power. The Germans drove a hard bargain, annexing huge swaths of territory from the Russians at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk early in 1918. As large numbers of German troops were transferred from the now redundant Eastern Front to reinforce a new spring offensive in the West, final victory seemed just around the corner. In his annual proclamation to the German people in August of 1918, the Kaiser assured everybody that the worst of the war was over. This was true enough, but not in the sense he intended. For the huge bloodletting that Ludenow's spring offensive had caused in the German army opened the way for the Allies, reinforced by massive numbers of fresh American troops and supplies, to breach German lines and advance rapidly along the Western Front. Morale in the German army started to collapse, and ever larger numbers of troops began to desert or surrender to the Allies. I wonder what people's thoughts were of America at the time. Like, did anybody know what America was capable of at all militarily? I guess there had been some, like, small conflict that had happened prior to this. When was the Spanish-American War? This would have been prior to this, right? We beat the fuck out of Spain. Yeah, this was in the late 19th century. So, because I'm just curious, like, why fuck with America? Why not just, like, shoot him a DM and be like, can we chill? I just don't know why... what the thinking was there on the German side. Or maybe they thought like, does America really have like a navy? Did we fight the Spanish Navy at all? I don't know. Because the UK was buying tons of shit. Okay. Morale in the German army started to collapse, and ever larger numbers of troops began to desert or surrender to the Allies. The final blows came as Germany's ally Bulgaria sued for peace, and the Habsburg armies in the south began to melt away in the face of renewed Italian attacks. And Habsburgs was that was the monarch of the Austrian Empire, that led the Austrian Empire, which was to the south of the German Empire, right? Okay. Hindenburg and Ludendorff were obliged to inform the Kaiser at the end of September the defeat was inevitable. A massive tightening of censorship ensured that newspapers continued to hold out the prospect of final victory for some time afterwards, when in reality it had long since disappeared. The shock waves sent out by the news of Germany's defeat were therefore all the greater. They were to prove too strong for what remained of the political system of the empire that Bismarck had created in 1871. It was in this cauldron of war and revolution that Nazism was forged. A mere 15 years separated the defeat of Germany in 1918 from the advent of the Third Reich in 1933. Yet, there would be many twists and turns along the way. The triumph of Hitler was by no means inevitable in 1918, any more than it had been pre-programmed by the previous course of German history. The creation of the German Reich and its rise to economic might and great power, status, had created expectations in many people, expectations that it was clear by this time the Reich and its institutions were unable to fulfill. The example of Bismarck as a supposedly ruthless, tough leader who was not afraid to use violence and deception to gain his ends was present in the minds of many, and the determination with which he had acted to curb the democratizing threat of political Catholicism and the socialist labor movement was widely admired in the Protestant middle classes. The silent dictatorship of Hindenburg and Ludendorff had put the precepts of ruthless authoritarian rule into practice at a moment of supreme national crisis in 1916 and created an ominous precedent for the future. Yeah, sure, why not? Fuck it. The legacy of the German past was a burdensome one in many respects. But it did not make the rise and triumph of Nazism inevitable. The shadows cast by Bismarck might eventually have been dispelled. By the time the First World War came to an end, however, they had deepened almost immeasurably. The problems bequeathed to the German political system by Bismarck and his successors were made infinitely worse by the effects of the war, and to these problems were added others that boded even more trouble for the future. Without the war, Nazism would not have emerged as a serious political force, nor would so many Germans have sought so desperately for an authoritarian alternative to the civilian politics that seemed so signally to have failed Germany in its hour of need. So high were the stakes, for which everybody was playing in 1914 to 1918, that both right and left were prepared to take measures of an extremism only dreamed of by figures on the margins of politics before the war. Massive recriminations about where the responsibility for Germany's defeat should lie only deepened political conflict. Sacrifice, privation, death on a huge scale left Germans of all political hues bitterly searching for the reason why. The almost unimaginable financial expense of the war created a vast economic burden on the world economy, which it was unable to shake off for another 30 years, and it fell most heavily upon Germany. The origins of national hatred in which all combatant nations had indulged during the war left a terrible legacy of bitterness for the future. Yet, as the German armies drifted home, and the Kaiser's regime prepared reluctantly to hand over to a democratic successor, there still seemed everything to play for. Wow, cute. Orgies, not origins. Sorry, wait, what? The orgies of national hatred in which all combatant nations had indulged. Sorry. The weaknesses of Weimar. Fear and hatred ruled the day in Germany at the end of the First World War. Gun battles, assassinations, riots, massacres, and civil unrest denied Germans the stability in which a new democratic order could flourish. Yet somebody had to take over the reins of government after the Kaiser's abdication and the collapse of the Reich created by Bismarck. The Social Democrats stepped into the breach. A group of leading figures in the labor movement emerged in the confusion of early November 1918 to form a revolutionary council of people's delegates, uniting for a brief period at least the two wings of the Social Democratic movement, the majority who had supported the war and the independents who had opposed it. The council was led by Friedrich Ebert, a longtime Social Democratic Party functionary. Born in 1871, the son of a tailor, he became a saddler and entered politics through his trade union activities. He worked on the editorial staff of the Social Democratic newspaper in Bremen, then in 1893 opened a pub in the city, which, like so many such institutions, functioned as a center for local labor organizations. By 1900, he was active in Bremen's municipal politics, and as leader of the local Social Democrats, he did much to improve the party's effectiveness. In 1905, he was elected secretary to the National Party's Central Committee in Berlin, and in 1912, he entered the Reichstag. Ebert won the respect of his party, not as a great orator or charismatic leader, but as a calm, patient, and subtle negotiator who always seemed to bring the different factions of the labor movement together. He was a typical pragmatist of the second generation of social democratic leaders, accepting the party's Marxist ideology, but concentrating his efforts on the day-to-day improvement of working-class life through his expertise in areas such as labor law and social insurance. It was his hard work that was mainly responsible for the remodeling and improved efficiency of the party's administration and electoral machine before the war, and he took a great deal of the credit for the party's famous victory in the Reichstag elections of 1912. On the death of the party's long-term leader, August Bebel, in 1913, Ebert was elected joint leader of the party alongside the more radical Hugo Haas. Like many social democratic organizers, Ebert put loyalty to the party above almost everything else, and his outrage at the refusal of Haas and other opponents of the war to follow majority decisions in the party was a major factor in persuading him to bring about their expulsion. Led by Haas, the dissidents formed the Independent Social Democrats in 1917 and worked from a variety of points of view to bring about an end to the war. Ebert believed in discipline and order, compromise and reform, and worked hard to bring about a cooperation with the Center Party and the left liberals during the war, in order to push the Kaiser's administration towards an acceptance of parliamentarism. Parliamentarism. Okay. Or parliamentarism. Parliamentarism. That one. Maybe? Yeah. His main aim in 1918 to 1919 was formulated by the characteristic concern of the sober administrator to keep essential services going, to stop the economy from collapsing, and to restore law and order. He was converted to the view that the Kaiser should abdicate only by the realization that a social revolution would break out if he did not. And, he added in conversation with the Kaiser's last chancellor, Prince Max of Baden, "I don't want that. Indeed, I hate it like sin." Instead of revolution, Ebert wanted parliamentary democracy. In collaboration with the Center Party and the left-wing liberals, now renamed the Democrats, Ebert and his associates in the Council of People's Delegates organized nationwide elections to a constituent assembly early in 1919 against the opposition of more radical elements who looked to the workers' and soldiers' councils to form the basis of some kind of Soviet-style administration. Many ordinary electors in Germany, whatever their private political views, saw voting for the three democratic parties as the best way to prevent the creation of a German Soviet and ward off the threat of a Bolshevik revolution. Not surprisingly, therefore, the Social Democrats, the Left Liberal Democrats, and the Center Party gained an overall majority in the elections to the Constituent Assembly. This met early in 1919 in the central German town of Weimar, long associated with the life and work of the 18th and early 19th century German poet, novelist, and dramatist Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. The Constitution, which it approved on the 31st of July, 1919, was essentially a modified version of the Constitution established by Bismarck for his new Reich nearly half a century before. In place of the Kaiser, there was a Reich president who was to be elected, like the President of the United States, by popular vote. Not only did this give him independent legitimacy in his dealings with the legislature, it also encouraged his use of the extensive emergency powers which he was granted under the Constitution's Article 48. In times of trouble, he could rule by decree and use the army to restore law and order in any federated state if he thought they were under threat. Well, that's so convenient. The power to rule by decree was only intended for exceptional emergencies, but Ebert, as the Republic's first president, made very extensive use of this power, employing it in no fewer than 136 separate occasions. He deposed legitimately elected governments in Saxony and Thuringia, when they threatened, in his view, to foment disorder. Even more dangerously, during the 1920 Civil War in the Ruhr, he issued a backdated decree applying the death penalty to public order offenses and retrospectively legitimizing many of the summary executions that had already been carried out on members of the Red Army by units of the Free Corps and the Regular Army. It was significant that on both occasions, these powers were used to suppress perceived threats to the Republic from the left, whereas they went virtually unused against what many saw as the far greater threat to it posed by the right. There were virtually no effective safeguards against an abuse of Article 48, since the president could threaten to use the power given him by Article 25 to dissolve the Reichstag should it reject a presidential decree. Moreover, decrees could, in any case, be used to create a fait accompli, or to bring about a situation in which the Reichstag had little option but to approve them. For example, though this was never intended, they could be used to intimidate and suppress opposition to the government in power. In some circumstances, no doubt, there was probably little alternative to some kind of rule by decree. But Article 48 included no proper provisions for the ultimate reassertion of power by the legislature in such an eventuality. And Ebert used it not just for emergencies, but also in non-emergency situations where steering legislation through the Reichstag would have been too difficult. In the end, Ebert's excessive use and occasional misuse of the article widened its application to a point where it became a potential threat to democratic institutions. Wow. Ebert's achievement in steering the Weimar Republic into being was undeniable. Yet, he made many hasty compromises that would return to haunt the Republic in different ways later on. His concern for a smooth transition from war to peace led him to collaborate closely with the army without demanding any changes in its fiercely monarchist and ultra-conservative officer corps, which he was certainly in a position to do in 1918 to 1919. Yet Ebert's willingness to compromise with the old order did not do anything to endear him to those who regretted its passing. Throughout the years of his presidency, he was subjected to a remorseless campaign of vilification in the right-wing press. For those who thought that the head of state should possess a remote Olympian dignity, far from the ordinariness of everyday life, a widely publicized newspaper photograph of the squat, podgy figure of the Reich president on a seaside holiday with a couple of friends, dressed only in bathing trunks, exposed him to ridicule and contempt. Other opponents in the muckraking right-wing press attempted to smear him through associating him with financial scandals. Ebert, perhaps foolishly, responded by firing off no fewer than 173 libel suits at those responsible, without ever once gaining satisfaction. In a criminal trial held in 1924, in which the accused was charged with calling Ebert a traitor to his country, the court fined the man the token sum of 10 marks because, as it concluded, Ebert had indeed shown himself to be a traitor by maintaining contacts with striking munitions workers in Berlin in the last year of the war, although he had in fact done so in order to bring the strike to a rapid negotiated end. The unending wave of hatred poured over Ebert by the extreme right had its effect, not merely in undermining his position, but also in wearing him down personally, both mentally and physically. Obsessed with trying to clear his name from all these smears, Ebert neglected a ruptured appendix that could have been dealt with quite easily by the medical science of the time, and he died, aged 54, on the 28th of February, 1925. Damn. The elections to the post of president that followed were a disaster for the democratic prospects of the Weimar Republic. What a loser. Don't highlight the footnote. We don't do that. Wait, why is it included? Okay, fuck it. I guess we are. The elections to the post of president that followed were a disaster for the democratic prospects of the Weimar Republic. The baleful influence of Weimar's political fragmentation and the lack of legitimacy made itself felt here, since in the first round, none of the candidates looked like winning. So the right drafted in the reluctant figure of Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg as a rallying point for their divided supporters. In the subsequent runoff, if either the Communists or the autonomous Bavarian wing of the Center Party had voted for Hindenburg's best-supported opponent, the Catholic politician Wilhelm Marx, the Field Marshal might have been defeated. But, thanks to the egotism above all of the Bavarians, he was elected by a clear majority. A symbol par excellence of the old military and imperial order, Hindenburg was a bulky, physically imposing man whose statuesque appearance, military uniform, war service medals, and legendary reputation, mostly undeserved, for winning the Great Battle of Tannenberg and for guiding Germany's military destiny thereafter, made him a much-revered figurehead, above all, for the right. Hindenburg's election was greeted by the forces of the right as a symbol of restoration. On 12/5, reported the conservative academic Victor Klemperer, an alarmed and unsympathetic observer, in his diary, as Hindenburg was sworn in, there were black, white, red flags everywhere. The Reich flag only on official buildings. 8 of 10 imperial flags Klemperer observed on this occasion were, he said, the small ones of the kind used by children. For many, Hindenburg's election was a big step away from Weimar democracy in the direction of a restoration of the old monarchical order. A rumor duly did the rounds that Hindenburg had felt it necessary to ask the ex-Kaiser Wilhelm, now in exile in Holland, for permission before he took up the post of president. It was untrue, but it said a great deal for Hindenburg's reputation that it gained currency. It's not true, but imagine what it says about society that people thought it was true, is what he's saying. Once in office and influenced by his strong sense of duty, Hindenburg, to the surprise of many, stuck to the letter of the Constitution, but as his 7-year term of office wore on, and he moved into his 80s, he became ever more impatient with the complexities of political events and ever more susceptible to the influence of his inner circle of advisors, all of whom shared his instinctive belief that the monarchy was the only legitimate sovereign power in the German Reich. Persuaded of the correctness of the use of presidential emergency powers by the example of his predecessor, Hindenburg began to feel that a conservative dictatorship exercised in his name was the only way out of the crisis into which the Republic fell at the beginning of the 1930s. Whatever influence Hindenburg's election might therefore have had in reconciling opponents of the Republic to its existence in the short run, in the long run it was an unmitigated disaster for Weimar democracy. By 1930 at the latest, it had become clear that the presidential power was in the hands of a man who had no faith in democratic institutions and no intention of defending them from their enemies. Okay. Destiny. This is unironically used all the time in history. Think of all the fake Churchill quotes, the fact that we think they are real says a lot about society's impressions of Churchill as a man. If you ever study ancient history, where we struggle sometimes to separate myths from histories, the fact that public believes something is an important value. Yeah, I will agree with you. Like, if you actually dig into, if you've ever seen like all those weird like the torture, the crazy ways that people used to torture people, like 90% of these are just totally fucking fake. Like, I don't think anybody ever actually did these. Like, when you look up the source of these, it'll be like Greece used to torture people this way, and the source will be like in the 1700s. One guy wrote this in his diary, referencing like a poet from the year 600 who wrote about a thing that he might have. It's always like I'm sure there's like a ton of shit like that. Besides the office of Reich president, Weimar's constitution provided for a national legislature named, as before, the Reichstag, but now elected by all adult women as well as all adult men, and by a more direct form of proportional representation than had been used before 1918. In effect, the electors voted for the party of their choice, and each party was allotted a number of seats in the Reichstag, precisely corresponding to the proportion of votes it received in the election. Thus, a party that received 30% of the vote would be allotted 30% of the seats, and, more worryingly, a party that received 1% of the vote would be allotted 1% of the seats. It has often been said that such a system favored small parties and fringe groups, and this was no doubt true. Yet, the fringe parties never achieved a combined vote of more than 15%, so it was in practice seldom necessary for the larger parties to take them into account when forming a government. Where proportional representation did have an effect, it was in evening out the chances of the large parties in the competition for votes, so that, if a first-past-the-post electoral system had been in operation, the bigger parties would have done better, and more stable coalition governments with a smaller number of coalition partners might have been possible, thus perhaps persuading a greater number of people in the virtues of parliamentarism. As it was, changes in government in the Weimar Republic were very frequent. Between February 13th, 1919, and January 30th of 1933, there were no fewer than 20 different cabinets, each lasting, on average, 239 days, or somewhat less than 8 months. Coalition government, it was sometimes said, made for unstable government, as the different parties were constantly squabbling over personalities and policies. It also made for weak government, since all they could settle on was the lowest common denominator and the line of least resistance. However, coalition government in Weimar was not just the product of proportional representation. Yeah, fuck parliaments. It also arose out of long-standing and deep fissures within the German political system. The parties that had dominated the imperial scene all survived into the Weimar Republic. The nationalists were formed by the amalgamation of the old Conservative Party with other smaller groups. The liberals failed to overcome their differences and remained divided into left, Democrats, and right, the People's Party. The Center Party remained more or less unchanged, though its Bavarian wing split off to form the Bavarian People's Party. On the left, the Social Democrats had to face a new rival in the form of the Communist Party, but none of this was solely or even principally the product of proportional representation. The political milieu out of which these various parties emerged had been in existence since the early days of the Bismarckian Empire. It's milieu, right? These milieu, with their party newspapers, clubs, and societies, were unusually rigid and homogeneous. Already before 1914, this had resulted in a politicization of whole areas of life that in other societies were much freer from ideological identifications. Thus, if an ordinary German wanted to join a male voice choir, for instance, he had to choose in some areas between a Catholic and a Protestant choir, in others between a socialist and a nationalist choir. The same went for gymnastics clubs, cycling clubs, football clubs, and the rest. A member of the Social Democratic Party, before the war, could have virtually his entire life encompassed by the party and its organizations. He could read a Social Democratic newspaper, go to a Social Democratic pub or bar, belong to a Social Democratic trade union, borrow books from the Social Democratic library, go to Social Democratic festivals and plays, marry a woman who belonged to the Social Democratic Women's Organization, enroll his children in the Social Democratic Youth Movement, and be buried with the aid of a Social Democratic burial fund. Similar things could be said of the Center Party, which could rely on the mass organization of supporters in the People's Association for a Catholic Germany, the Catholic Trade Union Movement, and Catholic leisure clubs and societies of all kind, but also to a certain extent of other parties too. These sharply defined political cultural milieu did not disappear with the advent of the Weimar Republic. But the emergence of commercialized mass leisure, the boulevard press, based on sensation and scandal, the cinema, cheap novels, dance halls, and leisure activities of all kinds, activities of all kinds, began in the 1920s to provide alternative sources of identification for the young, who were thus less tightly bound to political parties than their elders were. The older generation of political activists were too closely tied to their particular political ideology to find compromise and cooperation with other politicians and their parties very easy. In contrast to the situation after 1945, there was no merger of major political parties into larger and more effective units. As in a number of other respects, therefore, the political instability of the 1920s and early 1930s owed more to structural continuities with the politics of the Bismarckian and Wilhelmine eras than to the novel provisions of the Weimar Constitution. Yeah, let's do it. We'll do a big one. Fuck it. Proportional representation did not, as some have claimed, encourage political anarchy and thereby facilitate the rise of the extreme right. An electoral system based on a first-past-the-post system, where the candidate who won the most votes in each constituency automatically won the seat, might well have given the Nazi Party even more seats than it eventually obtained in the last elections of the Weimar Republic, though, since the party's electoral tactics would have been different under such a system, and its arguably beneficial effects in the earlier phases of the Republic's existence might have reduced the overall Nazi vote later on, it is impossible to tell for sure. I like that he includes that, like, when things change, other things change too. Like, people will say, like, would Russia have won the war, or would the Soviets have done as well without U.S. assistance, or would this have happened to this? It's like, maybe, but like, if that one thing changed, everybody else's actions would have changed accordingly, and then everything from there would have changed as well, right? Like, historical counterfactuals are never just changing one thing and then everybody would act literally the exact same way. Like, everybody's actions would have changed in response to that, right? Similarly, the destabilizing effect of the Constitution's provision for referendums or plebiscites has often been exaggerated. Other political systems have existed perfectly happily with such a provision, and in any case, the actual number of plebiscites that actually took place was very small. The campaigning they involved certainly helped keep the overheated political atmosphere of the Republic at boiling point, but national plebiscites had little direct political effect, despite the fact that one provincial plebiscite did succeed in overthrowing a democratic government in Oldenburg in 1932. Wow, map 4, the Weimar Republic. Wow, crazy. In any case, the governmental instability of Weimar has itself often been overdrawn, with the frequent changes of government concealed long-term continuities in particular ministries. Some posts, notably the Ministry of Justice, were used as bargaining counters in inter-party coalition negotiations, and so saw a succession of many different ministers, no doubt putting more power than usual into the hands of the senior civil servants, who stayed there all through, though their freedom of action was curtailed by the devolution of many functions of judicial administration to the federated states. But others became the virtual prerequisite of a particular politician through all the vagaries of coalition building. Vagaries? Of coalition building, thus making it easier to formulate and implement strong and decisive policies. Gustav Stresemann, the leading figure in the People's Party, for instance, was foreign minister in 9 successive administrations and remained in office for an unbroken period of over 6 years. Heinrich Brauns, a Center Party deputy, was Minister of Labor in 12 successive cabinets from June of 1920 up to June of 1928. Otto Gessler, a Democrat, was Army Minister in 13 successive governments from March of 1920 to January of 1928. Such ministers were able to develop and implement long-term policies, irrespective of the frequent turnover of leadership experienced by the governments they served in. Other ministries were also occupied by the same politicians through 2, 3, or 4 different governments. Not by chance, it was in such areas that the Republic was able to develop its strongest and most consistent policies, above all in the fields of foreign affairs, labor, and welfare. The ability of the Reich government to act firmly and decisively, however, was always compromised by another provision of the Constitution, namely its decision to continue the federal structure which Bismarck had imposed on the Reich in 1871 in an effort to sugar the pill of unification for German princes such as the King of Bavaria and the Grand Duke of Baden. When we say federal structure, what does that mean? Are they referring to parliament plus president, or are they referring to... Or did they just mean like having states inside of a larger state? States. Okay, yeah, okay. Federal is federated. Okay, yeah. The princes had been unceremoniously thrown out in the Revolution of 1918, but their states remained. They were equipped now with democratic, parliamentary institutions, but still retained a good deal of autonomy in key areas of domestic policy. The fact that some of the states, like Bavaria, had a history and an identity going back many centuries, encouraged them to obstruct the policies of the Reich government if they did not like them. On the other hand, direct taxation was now in the hands of the Reich government, and many of the smaller states were dependent on handouts from Berlin when they got into financial difficulties. Attempts at secession from the Reich might seem threatening, especially in the Republic's troubled early years, but in reality they were never strong enough to be taken seriously. Worse problems could be caused by tensions between Prussia and the Reich, since the Prussian state was bigger than all the rest combined. But through the 1920s and early 1930s, Prussia was led by moderate, pro-Republican governments, which constituted an important counterweight to the extremism and instability of states such as Bavaria. When all these factors are taken into account, therefore, it does not seem that the federal system, for all its unresolved tensions between the Reich and the states, was a major factor in undermining the stability and legitimacy of the Weimar Republic. I guess these are probably worth... All in all, Weimar Germany's constitution was no worse than the constitutions of most other countries in the 1920s, and a good deal more democratic than many. Its more problematical provisions might not have mattered so much had circumstances been different. But the fatal lack of legitimacy from which the Republic suffered magnified the Constitution's faults many times over. 3 political parties were identified with the new political system: the Social Democrats, the Liberal German Democratic Party, and the Center Party. After gaining a clear majority of 76.2% of the vote in January of 1919, these 3 parties combined won just 48% of the vote in June of 1920, 43% of the vote in May of 1924, 49.6% in December of 1924, 49.9% in 1928, and 43% in September of 1930. From 1920 onwards, they were thus in a permanent minority in the Reichstag, outnumbered by deputies whose allegiance lay with the Republic's enemies to the right and to the left. And the support of these parties, of the Weimar coalition for the Republic, was, at best, often more rhetorical than practical, and at worst, equivocal, compromised, or of no political use at all. So, colloquially, as he's speaking here, Weimar Germany was the parliamentary, federated, democratic thing that existed after the Revolution of 1918. And whenever he refers to, like, the Republic, his allegiance lay with the Republic's enemies. No, the Republic is the same. Okay. So you have the competing forces of, like, the Weimar Republic, the democratic thing, and then people who longed for, I guess, the days of the... Was the Bismarckian thing, was that considered the Second Reich, or what do they call that? The Empire, basically, the German Empire, I guess. Oh, I guess, was the First Reich like the 1,000-year German bullshit? I don't know anything about that. Fuck that. Cringe. Was it the Holy Roman Empire? Oh, okay, gotcha. No one cares. Europe is cringe. Okay. The Social Democrats were considered by many to be the party that had created the Republic, and often said so themselves. Yet, they were never very happy as a party of government, took part in only 8 out of the 20 Weimar cabinets, and only filled the office of Reich Chancellor in 4 of them. They remained locked in the Marxist ideological mold of the pre-war years, still expecting capitalism to be overthrown and the bourgeois to be replaced as the ruling class by the proletariat. Whatever else it was, Germany in the 1920s was undeniably a capitalist society, and playing a leading role in government seemed to many Social Democrats to sit rather uneasily alongside the verbal radicalism of their ideology. Unused to the experience of government, excluded from political participation for 2 generations before the war, they found the experience of collaborating with bourgeois politicians a painful one. They could not rid themselves of their Marxist ideology without losing a large part of their electoral support in the working class. Yet on the other hand, a more radical policy, for example, of forming a Red Army militia from workers instead of relying on the Free Corps, would surely have made their participation in bourgeois coalition governments impossible and called down upon their heads the wrath of the army. The main strength of the Social Democrats lay in Prussia, the state that covered over half the territory of the Weimar Republic and contained 57% of its population. Okay, wait, hold on. Okay, map 4 is the Weimar Republic. How big is... Why does it feel like Prussia's like the whole fucking thing? Fuck these maps that are in black and white. The entire top half of the image. Yeah, I see that, but like... Where does Prussia end going south? Better map. Oh, thank you. This is an actual good map. Damn. Okay, and then the blue thing is Prussia. Gotcha. And then Prussia's cut off by Poland there as a result of the The negotiated land after World War I guaranteed Poland some right to the Baltic Sea. That's what that is up there. So it gets cut off. Damn. Absolutely cocked. Here, in a mainly Protestant area with great cities such as Berlin and industrial areas like the Ruhr, they dominated the government. Their policy was to make Prussia a bastion of Weimar democracy, and although they did not pursue reforms with any great vigor or consistency, right? Yeah. Removing them from power in Germany's biggest state became a major objective of the Weimar democracy's enemies by the early 1930s. In the Reich, however, their position was far less dominant. Their strength at the beginning of the Republic owed a good deal to the support of middle-class voters who considered that a strong social democratic party would offer the best defense against Bolshevism by effecting a quick transition to parliamentary democracy. As the threat receded, so their representation in the Reichstag went down, from 163 seats in 1919 to 102 in 1920. Despite a substantial recovery later on, 153 seats in 1928 and 143 in 1930, the Social Democrats permanently lost nearly 2.5 million votes. And after receiving 38% of the votes in 1919, they hovered around 25% for the rest of the 1920s and early 1930s. Nevertheless, they remained an enormously powerful and well-organized political movement that claimed the allegiance and devotion of millions of industrial workers across the land. If any one party deserved to be called the bulwark of democracy in the Weimar Republic, it was the Social Democrats. The second arm of the Weimar coalition, the German Democratic Party, was a somewhat more enthusiastic participant in government, serving in virtually all the cabinets of the 1920s. It had, after all, been a Democrat, Hugo Preuss, who had been the principal author of the much-maligned Weimar Constitution. But although they won 75 seats in the election of January of 1919, they lost 36 of them in the next election in June of 1920, and were down to 28 seats in the election of May of 1924. Victims of the rightward drift of middle-class voters, they never recovered. Their response to their losses after the elections of 1928 was disastrous. Led by Erich Koch-Weiser, leading figures in the party joined in July of 1930 with a paramilitary offshoot of the youth movement known as the Young German Order and some individual politicians from other middle-class parties to transform the Democrats into the state party. The idea was to create a strong centrist bloc that would stem the flow of bourgeois voters to the Nazis. But the merger had been precipitate. Okay. And closed off the possibility of joining together with other larger political groups in the middle. Oh, the merger was too early. They shouldn't have done it as early, I guess. It cut off other possibilities? Sure. Okay. Some, mostly left-wing Democrats, objected to the move and resigned. On the right, the Young German Order's move lost its support among many of its own members. The electoral fortunes of the new party did not improve, and only 14 deputies represented it in the Reichstag after the elections of September 1930. In practice, the merger meant a sharp shift to the right. The Young German Order shared the skepticism of much of the youth movement about the parliamentary system, and its ideology was more than tinged with anti-Semitism. The new state party continued to keep the Social Democratic coalition in Prussia afloat until the state elections of April 1932, but its aim, announced by the historian Friedrich Meinecke, right, was now to achieve a shift in the balance of political power away from the Reichstag and the states and towards a strong unitary Reich government. Here, too, therefore, a steady erosion of support pushed the party to the right, but the only effect of this was to wipe out whatever distinguished it from other, more effective political organizations that were arguing for the same kind of thing. The state party's convoluted constitutional schemes not only signaled its lack of political realism, but also its weakening commitment to Weimar democracy. Of the three parties of the Weimar coalition, only the Center Party maintained its support throughout at around 5 million votes. Okay. Or 85 to 90 seats in the Reichstag, including those of the Bavarian People's Party. Fuck, do I need all three of these? I don't know. Sure, why not? The Center Party was also a key part of every coalition government from June of 1919 to the very end, and with its strong interest in social legislation, probably had a strong claim to have been the driving force behind the creation of Weimar's welfare state, probably had as strong a claim to have been the driving force behind the creation of Weimar's welfare state as the Social Democrats did. Socially conservative, it devoted much of its time to fighting pornography, contraception, and other evils of the modern world, and to defending Catholic interests in the school system. Its Achilles heel was the influence inevitably wielded over it by the papacy, right? In Rome. As head of the Catholic Church, Pope Pius XI was increasingly worried by the advance of atheistic communists and socialists during the 1920s. Together with his nuncio in Germany, right, Eugenio Pacelli, who subsequently became Pope Pius XII, he profoundly distrusted the political liberalism of many Catholic politicians and saw a turn to a more authoritarian form of politics as the safest way to preserve the Church's interests from the looming threat of the godless left. This led to his conclusion of a concordat with Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy in 1929, and later on to the Church's support for the clerico-fascist dictatorship of Engelbert Dollfuss in the Austrian Civil War of 1934. And the nationalists under General Franco in the Spanish Civil War that began in 1936. With such signals emanating from the Vatican, even in the 1920s, the prospects for political Catholicism in Germany were not good. They became markedly worse in December of 1928, when a close associate of Papal Nuncio Pacelli, Prelate Ludwig Kaas, a priest who was also a deputy in the German Reichstag, succeeded in being elected leader of the Center Party as a compromise candidate during a struggle between factions of the right and left over the succession to the retiring chairman, Wilhelm Marx. Under Pacelli's influence, however, Kaas veered increasingly towards the right, pulling many Catholic politicians with him. As increasing disorder and instability began to grip the Reich in 1930 and 1931, Kaas, now a frequent visitor to the Vatican, began to work together with Pacelli for a concordat along the lines of the agreement recently concluded with Mussolini. Securing the future existence of the Church was paramount in such a situation. Like many other leading Catholic politicians, Kaas considered that this was only really possible in an authoritarian state where police regression stamped out the threat from the left. Never, declared Kaas in 1929, has the call for leadership on the grand scale echoed more vividly and impatiently through the soul of the German people as in the days when the fatherland and its culture have been in such peril that the soul of all of us has been oppressed. Kaas demanded, among other things, much greater independence for the executive from the legislature in Germany. Another leading Center Party politician, Eugen Bolz, minister-president of Württemberg, sounds like an elite in Halo, put it more bluntly, when he told his wife early in 1930, "I have long been of the opinion that the parliament cannot solve severe domestic political problems. If a dictator for 10 years were a possibility, I would want it." Long before January 30th of 1933, the Center Party had ceased to be the bulwark of Weimar democracy that it had once been. Wow. What are you guys doing? Map 5, the religious divide. You can see in the top part, which is all Prussia, all the Protestants. And then the bottom part are all Catholics. Cringe. Name like bulls sounds like TS. Bolts. Okay. Thus, even the major political props of democracy in the Weimar Republic were crumbling by the end of the 1920s. Beyond them, the democratic landscape was even more desolate. No other parties offered serious support to the Republic and its institutions. On the left, the Republic was confronted with the mass phenomenon of the communists. In the revolutionary period from 1918 to 1921, they were a tightly knit elite group with little electoral support. But when the independent Social Democrats, deprived of the unifying factor of opposition to the First World War, fell apart in 1922, a large number of them joined the Communists, who thus became a mass party. Already in 1920, the combined forces of the independent Social Democrats and the Communists won 88 seats in the Reichstag. In May of 1924, the Communists won 62 seats, and after a small drop later in the year, they were back to 54 in 1928 and 77 in 1930. 3.25 million people cast their votes for the party in May of 1924 and over 4.5 million in September of 1930. These were all votes for the destruction of the Weimar Republic. Through all the twists and turns of its policies during the 1920s, the Communist Party of Germany never deviated from its belief that the Republic was a bourgeois state whose primary purposes were the protection of the capitalist economic order and the exploitation of the working class. Capitalism, they hoped, would inevitably collapse, and the bourgeois republic would be replaced by a Soviet state along Russian lines. It was the duty of the Communist Party to bring this about as soon as possible. In the early years of the Republic, this meant preparing for an October Revolution in Germany by means of an armed revolt. But after the failure of the January Uprising in 1919, and the even more catastrophic collapse of plans for an uprising in 1923, this idea was put on hold. Steered increasingly from Moscow, where the Soviet regime, under the growing influence of Stalin, tightened its financial and ideological grip on communist parties everywhere in the second half of the 1920s, the German Communist Party had little option but to swing to a more moderate course in the mid-1920s, only to return to a radical leftist position at the end of the decade. This meant not only refusing to join with the Social Democrats in the defense of the Republic, but even actively collaborating with the Republic's enemies in order to bring it down. Indeed, the party's hostility to the Republic and its institutions even caused it to oppose reforms that might lead the Republic to become more popular among the working class. Rip. Implacable? You can't placate. Implacable? It's implacable. This implacable opposition to the Republic from the left was more than balanced by rabid animosity from the right. The largest and most significant right-wing challenge to Weimar was mounted by the Nationalists, who gained 44 Reichstag seats in January of 1919, 71 in June of 1920, 95 in May of 1924, and 103 in December of 1924. This made them larger than any other party with the exception of the Social Democrats. In both elections of 1924, they won around 20% of the vote. 1 in 5 people who cast their ballot in these elections thus did so for a party that made it clear from the outset that it regarded the Weimar Republic as utterly illegitimate and called for a restoration of the Bismarckian Reich and the return of the Kaiser. This was expressed in many different ways, from the Nationalists' championing of the old imperial flag, black, white, and red, in place of the new Republican colors of black, red, and gold, to their tacit and sometimes explicit condoning of the assassination of key Republican politicians by armed conspiratorial groups allied to the Free Corps. The propaganda and policies of the Nationalists did much to spread radical right-wing ideas across the electorate in the 1920s and prepare the way for Nazism. During the 1920s, the Nationalists were a party in 2 coalition governments, but the experience was not a happy one. They resigned from one government after 10 months, and when they came into another cabinet halfway through its term of office, they were forced to make compromises that left many party members deeply dissatisfied. Severe losses in the elections of October 1928, when the Nationalists' representation in the Reichstag fell from 103 seats to 73, convinced the right wing of the party that it was time for a more uncompromising line. The Traditionalist Party chairman, Count Westarp, was ousted and replaced by the press baron, industrialist, and radical nationalist Alfred Hugenberg, who had been a leading light of the pan-German movement since its inception in the 1890s. The Nationalist Party program of 1931, drafted under Hugenberg's influence, was distinctly more right-wing than its predecessors. It demanded, among other things, the restoration of the Hohenzollern monarchy, which that was the, not the Habsburgs, but the other people, right? The von Loser people? Kaiser Wilhelm, yeah, those guys. The Royal Family Journey, yeah, okay. The fuck is RTBA? That's how we make all our money here, okay? It demanded, among other things, the restoration of the Hohenzollern monarchy, compulsory military service, a strong foreign policy directed at the revision of the Treaty of Versailles, the return of the lost overseas colonies, and the strengthening of ties with Germans living in other parts of Europe, especially Austria. The Reichstag was to retain only a supervisory role and a critical voice in legislation, and to be joined by a representational body structured according to professional rankings in the economic and cultural spheres, along the lines of the corporate state being created at the time in fascist Italy. And, the program went on, we resist the subversive, un-German spirit in all forms, whether it stems from Jewish or other circles. We are emphatically opposed to the prevalence of Judaism in the government and in public life, a prevalence that has emerged ever more continuously since the Revolution. Under Hugenberg, the Nationalists also moved away from internal party democracy and closer to the leadership principle. The party's new leader made strenuous efforts to make party policy on his own and direct the party's Reichstag delegation in its votes. A number of Reichstag deputies opposed this, and a dozen of them split off from the party in December of 1929 and more in June of 1930, joining fringe groups of the right in protest. Hugenberg allied the party with the extreme right in an attempt to get a popular referendum to vote against the Young Plan, an internationally agreed scheme brokered by the Americans for the rescheduling of reparations payments in 1929. The failure of the bitterly fought campaign only convinced Hugenberg of the need for even more extreme opposition to Weimar and its replacement by an authoritarian nationalist state harking back to the glorious days of the Bismarckian Empire. None of this worked. The nationalist snobbery and elitism prevented them from winning a real mass following and rendered their supporters vulnerable to the blandishments of the truly populist demagoguery practiced by the Nazis. Less extreme, but only marginally less vehemently opposed to the Republic, was the smaller People's Party, the heir of the old pro-Bismarckian National Liberals. It won 65 seats in the 1920 election, and stayed around 45 to 50 for the rest of the decade, attracting about 2.7 to 3 million votes. The party's hostility to the Republic was partly masked by the decision of its leading figure, Gustav Stresemann, to recognize political realities for the movement and accept the legitimacy of the Republic more out of necessity than conviction. Although he was never fully trusted by his party, Stresemann's powers of persuasion were considerable. Not least thanks to the consummate negotiating skills, the People's Party took part in most of the Republic's cabinets, unlike the Nationalists, who stayed in opposition for the greater part of the 1920s. Yet, this meant that the majority of governments formed after the initial phase of the Republic's existence contained at least some ministers who were dubious, to say the least, about its right to exist. Moreover, Stresemann, already in difficulties with his party, fell ill and died, like a loser, in October of 1929, thus removing the principal moderating influence from the party's leadership. From this point on, it too gravitated rapidly towards the far right. Even in the mid-1920s, therefore, the political system was looking extremely fragile. In other circumstances, it might have survived. In retrospect, indeed, the period of 1924 to 1928 has been described by many as Weimar's golden years. But the idea that democracy was on the way to establishing itself in Germany at this time is an illusion created by hindsight. There was in reality no sign that it was becoming more secure. On the contrary, the fact that the two major bourgeois parties, the Center Party and the Nationalists, soon fell into the hands of avowed enemies of democracy boded ill for the future, even without the shocks to come. Fuck! Okay, sorry. That the allegiance of the People's Party to the Republic, such as it was, owed everything to the persistence and intelligent leadership of one man, Gustav Stresemann, was another sign of fragility. Not even in the relatively favorable circumstances of 1928 had the parties of the Weimar coalition succeeded in gaining a majority in the Reichstag. The widespread feeling after 1923 that the threat of a Bolshevik revolution had receded meant that the bourgeois parties were no longer so willing to compromise with the Social Democrats in the interests of preserving the Republic as a bulwark against communism. Okay, hold on. When we say the bourgeois parties, the Center Party and the Nationalists. Okay, the Center Party was part of the pro-Weimar people, and the Nationalists weren't super anti-Weimar Republic. Okay. So when they say bourgeois, was this just like the cultural and social elites or whatever? Is that what they mean here? Or the people who were in favor of like... Wait, am I live or am I shit? Fuck, I hit the power button on my fucking computer like a retard. The Nationalists were very against democracy. They were the guys that wanted to return the cards. Yeah, but it seemed like the one political leader guy was good at keeping that at bay. Or it was more realistic, I guess. The Stresemann guy? Okay. Wait, that was the other right-wing party. Oh, that was the smaller People's Party. You're right. Okay, never mind. Okay. Jesus. Okay, sorry. My shit got fucked. All right. And, more ominously still, paramilitary organizations such as the Steel Helmets were beginning to extend their struggle from the streets to the hustings in an attempt to win more influence for their anti-Republican views. Meanwhile, political violence, though it fell short of the open civil war that characterized much of the Republic's opening phase, still continued at an alarmingly high level throughout the mid-1920s. The brutal fact was that even in 1928, the Republic was as far away from achieving stability and legitimacy as ever. The Weimar Republic was also weakened by its failure to win the wholehearted support of the army and the civil service, both of which found it extremely difficult to adjust to the transition from the authoritarian Reich to the Democratic Republic in 1918. For the army leadership in particular, defeat in 1918 posed an alarming threat. Led by one of its most intelligent and perceptive officers, General Wilhelm Groener is like every other person in Germany at this point named Wilhelm. Holy fuck. General Wilhelm Groener, the General Staff agreed with the majority Social Democrats under Friedrich Ebert that the threat of the Revolutionary Workers' and Soldiers' Council would best be warded off if they worked in tandem to secure a stable parliamentary democracy. From Groener's point of view, Gruner? Is it Gruner, do you think? From Gruner's point of view, this was an act of expediency, not of faith. It secured the preservation of the old officer corps in the reduced circumstances of the German army after the Treaty of Versailles. The army's numbers were restricted to 100,000. It was banned from using modern technology, such as tanks, and a mass conscript military force had to give way to a small professional one. Groener. Groener ran into fierce opposition from army diehards for compromising with the Social Democrats, just as his opposite number, the Social Democrats' military specialist Gustav Noske, ran into fierce criticism from his party comrades for allowing the officer corps to remain intact instead of replacing it with a more democratic structure and personnel. But in the desperate circumstances of 1918 to 19, their line won through in the end. Within a short space of time, however, the workers' and soldiers' councils had faded from the political scene, and the need for compromise with the forces of democracy seemed to many leading officers to have lost its urgency. This became dramatically clear in March of 1920, when Free Corps units, protesting against their impending redundancy, marched on Berlin and overthrew the elected government in a bid to restore an authoritarian regime on the lines of the old monarchy. Led by the pan-German former civil servant and leading light of the old Fatherland Party, Wolfgang Kapp, the insurrectionists were also supported by elements within the armed forces in a number of areas. When the chief of the army command, oh my God, wait, are we going to get, is this the one thing? Never mind, maybe not. Okay, we're getting there. The insurrectionists were also supported by elements within the armed forces in a number of areas. It's not the thing. When the chief of the army command, General Walther Reinhardt, tried to ensure the force's loyalty to the government, he was ousted in favor of the more right-wing General Hans von Siecht. Siecht promptly banned all army units from opposing the plotters and turned a blind eye to those which backed them. Subsequently, he ordered the army to cooperate in the bloody suppression of the workers' armed uprising against the Putsch in the Ruhr. Siecht had indeed been hostile to the Republic from the beginning. Aloof, authoritarian, and unapproachable, his upper-class credentials advertised by the monocle he wore over his left eye, he epitomized the traditions of the Prussian officer class. But he was also a political realist who saw that the possibilities of overthrowing the Republic by force were limited. He aimed, therefore, to keep the army united and free from parliamentary control, waiting for better times. In this, he had the full support of his fellow officers. Under Siecht's leadership, the army retained in its war flag the old imperial colors of black, white, and red. Siecht distinguished sharply between the German state, which incorporated the abstract ideal of the Reich, and the Republic, which he regarded as a temporary aberration. General Wilhelm Groener, Siecht's mentor, described the army in 1928 as the only power and an element of power within the state that no one can disregard. Under Siecht's leadership, the army was far from being a neutral organization, standing aloof from the party political fray, whatever Siecht might have claimed. Siecht did not hesitate to intervene against the elected government when he believed that it went against the Reich's interests. He even considered taking over the chancellorship himself on one occasion with a program that envisaged the centralization of the Reich and the curbing of Prussian autonomy, the abolition of the trade unions, and their replacement by occupational chambers, rather like those later created by Mussolini in Italy. And, in general, the suppression of all tendencies directed against the existence of the Reich and against the legitimate authority of the Reich and the state through the use of the means of power of the Reich. In the end, he succeeded in toppling the government, but did not manage to become chancellor himself. That was to be left to one of his successors, General Kurt von Schleicher, who belonged to Sieg's close group of advisors in the years when he ran the army command. A law unto itself for most of the time, the army did its best during the 1920s to circumvent the restrictions placed upon it by the Treaty of Versailles. It's saked, not seeked, saked. Making common cause behind the scenes with another diminished and resentful great power, the Soviet Union, the army leadership arranged for clandestine training operations, clandestine training sessions in Russia for officers anxious to learn how to use tanks and aeroplanes and willing to engage in experiments with poison gas. I don't know about that. Damn. Secret arrangements were made to train auxiliary troops in an attempt to get round the limit of 100,000 imposed by the treaty on the army's strength, and the army was constantly eyeing the paramilitaries as a potential military reserve. These subterfuges and others, including training with make-believe tanks, made clear that the army had no intention of abiding by the terms of the 1919 peace settlement and would break free from it as soon as circumstances allowed. Far from being led exclusively by dyed-in-the-wool Prussian conservatives, these clandestine circumventions of the treaty were organized above all by modern-minded technicians impatient with the constraints of democratic politics and international agreements. The disloyalty of the army and the repeated intrigues of its leading officers against civilian governments boded ill for the Republic's continued viability in a real crisis. If Germany's first democracy could not expect much support from its military servants, then neither could it hope for much support from its civil servants, whom it likewise inherited from the old German Reich. The civil service was of huge importance because it covered a wide area of society and included not just officials working in the central administration of the Reich, but also all those state employees who had secured the tenure, status, and emoluments originally designed for senior administrators. They included officials working for the federated states, for state enterprises like the railways and the postal service, and for state institutions such as universities and schools, so that university professors and high school teachers fell into this category as well. The numbers of civil servants in this broad sense were enormous. Below this relatively exalted level, there were millions more state servants living off salaries or wages paid by state institutions. The German state railway was by far the largest single employer in the Weimar Republic, for instance, with 700,000 people working for it at the end of the 1920s. It was followed by the postal service with 380,000. If family members, dependents, and pensioners are added on, about 3 million people relied for their support on the railways alone. Altogether, by the end of the 1920s, there were 1.6 million civil servants in Germany, about half of whom worked for the state proper, the other half for public utilities such as the railways. With such a large number of state employees, it was clear that the state employment sector was politically extremely diverse, with hundreds of thousands of employees belonging to socialist trade unions, liberal political parties, or pressure groups of widely varying political orientation. 1 million civil servants belonged to the Liberal German Civil Servants League in 1919, though 60,000 split off to form a more right-wing group in 1921, and another 350,000 seceded to form a trade union the following year. Civil servants were in no sense, therefore, uniformly hostile to the Republic at the outset, despite their training and socialization in the years of the Wilhelmine Reich. Wilhelmine Reich. Wilhelmine, you think? Maybe. As the leading figure in the transitional revolutionary administration, Friedrich Ebert appealed on November 9th, 1918, for all civil servants and state employees to continue working in order to avoid anarchy. The overwhelming majority stayed on. Civil servants' career structure and duties were unchanged. The Weimar Constitution made them irremovable. However, it might have appeared in theory, in practice, this step made it virtually impossible to dismiss civil servants, given the extreme difficulty of proving in law that they had violated their oath of allegiance. As an institution that derived from the authoritarian and bureaucratic states of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, long before the advent of parliaments and political parties, The higher civil service, in particular, had been long accustomed to regard itself as the true ruling caste, above all in Prussia. Up to 1918, for instance, all government ministers had been civil servants appointed by the monarch, not by the Reichstag or the legislative assemblies of the federated states. In some Reich ministries, where there was a rapid turnover of ministers under the Republic, the top civil servant could wield enormous power, as with Kurt Joel. Is it Kurt Joel or is it Kurt Joel? In the Ministry of Justice, who served virtually throughout the Republic, while no fewer than 17 justice ministers came and went before he finally became minister himself in 1930. For such men, administrative continuity was the supreme dictative duty, overriding all political considerations. Whatever they might have thought privately of the Putschists, in March of 1920, senior civil servants in Berlin, including financial officials, thus carried on with their work in defiance of the Putschists' orders for them to stand down. The neutrality of civil servants on this occasion owed a good deal to their characteristically punctilious insistence on the duties imposed by their oath of allegiance. Later on, in 1922, the government introduced a new law designed to bind civil servants even more closely to the Republic and impose disciplinary sanctions on those who consorted with its enemies. But this measure was relatively toothless. Only in Prussia was there a serious effort, led by Karl Severing and Albert Grzinski, successive social democratic ministers of the interior, to replace old imperial administrators, above all in the provinces, with social democrats and others loyal to the Republic. Nevertheless, even the Prussian efforts at creating a civil service loyal to the principles of democracy, as well as imbued with a sense of duty in serving the government of the day, proved insufficient in the end. Because Severing and Grzinski thought that the parties should be represented in the higher civil service, roughly in proportion to their place in the Prussian coalition cabinets, this meant that a good number of important posts were held by men from parties such as the Center Party, the People's Party, and to a degree, the State Party, whose allegiance to the Republic was rapidly becoming more tenuous from the end of the 1920s onwards. In the rest of Germany, including the level of the Reich civil service, even this degree of reform was barely even attempted, let alone achieved, and the civil service was far more conservative, even in parts downright hostile to the Republic. The problem, however, was not so much that the higher civil service was actively helping to undermine Weimar. Rather, it was that the Republic did too little to ensure that civil servants at whatever level were actively committed to the democratic political order and would resist any attempt to overthrow it. And those civil servants who were actively hostile to the Republic, probably a minority considered overall, were able to survive with relative impunity. Thus, for instance, one senior Prussian civil servant, born in 1885 and a member of the Nationalist Party after 1918, founded a variety of fringe groups for civil servants and others aiming explicitly to combat the Reichstag, the Red headquarters, to frustrate the policies of the treasonous and godless Social Democrats, to oppose the imperialist world power of the Catholic Church, and finally to fight against all Jews. His anti-Semitism, fairly late before 1918, became explicit after the Revolution. Thereafter, he later recalled, whenever a Jew was carrying on impertinently on the elevated railway or on the train and would not accept my scolding without further impertinence, I threatened to throw him off the moving train if he did not shut up immediately. On one occasion, he threatened Marxist workers with a gun. His was an obviously extreme example of a civil servant opposed to the Republic. Yet he was not dismissed, only disciplined twice and denied promotion, despite being tried on one occasion for disturbing the peace. I always, he wrote, took it to be a weakness of my political enemies in the civil service that they let me get off so easily every time. The worst that happened to him under the Republic was a blockage of his career prospects. There can be little doubt that, even in the Republican bastion of Prussia, the vast majority of civil servants had little genuine loyalty to the Constitution to which they had sworn their allegiance. Should the Republic be threatened with destruction, very few of them indeed would even think of coming to its aid. Devotion to duty kept them working when the state was challenged, as is the Cap Push of 1920. Push. But it would also keep them working when the state was overthrown. Here was another central institution whose loyalty was to an abstract concept of the Reich rather than to the concrete principles of democracy. In this, as in other respects, Weimar was weak in political legitimacy from the start. It was beset by insurmountable problems of political violence, assassination, and irreconcilable conflicts about its right to exist. It was unloved and undefended by its servants in the army and bureaucracy. It was blamed by many for the national humiliation, the Treaty of Versailles, and it also had to face enormous economic problems, beginning with the massive monetary inflation that made life so difficult for so many in the years when it was trying to establish itself. It's just putsch, pooch, pooch, putsch, pooch, putsch. Why is every chapter chapter 1? Am I looping? Fuck this. Pooch, like butcher. Ugh. Putsch, pooch, putsch. Putsch. Even the most diehard reactionary might eventually have learned to tolerate the Republic if it had provided a reasonable level of economic stability and a decent solid income for its citizens. But from the start, it was beset by economic failures of a dimension unprecedented in German history. As soon as the First World War had begun, the Reich government had started to borrow money to pay for it. From 1916 onwards, expenditure had far exceeded the revenue that the government had been able to raise from loans or indeed from any other source. Naturally enough, it had expected to recoup its losses by annexing rich industrial areas to the east or to the west and east, by forcing the defeated nations to pay large financial reparations, and by imposing a new German-dominated economic order on a conquered Europe. But these expectations were dashed. In the event, it was Germany that was the defeated nation, and Germany that had to foot the bill. This made things far worse than before. The government had been printing money without the economic resources to back it. Before the war, the dollar had been worth just over 4 paper marks on the exchange in Berlin. By 1918, it took nearly twice as many marks to buy a US dollar. The rate continued to decline to just over 12 marks to the dollar in April of 1919 and 47 by the end of the year. Successive governments of the Weimar Republic were caught in a political trap that was at least partly of their own making. The need to export government revenue to other countries in the form of reparations payments meant an additional drain on resources at a time when wartime debts still had to be paid, and Germany's economic resources and domestic market had shrunk. Heavily populated industrial areas in Lorraine and Silesia had been removed under the terms of the treaty. Industrial production was only 42% in 1919 of what it had been in 1913. And the country was producing less than half the grain it had produced before the war. Massive expenditure was required to fund the adjustment to a peacetime economy and to provide welfare measures for ex-soldiers seeking jobs or unable to find them because of war disability. Yet, if any government sought to bridge the gap by raising taxes by any more than a small amount, it would immediately be accused by its enemies on the nationalists' right of imposing taxes in order to meet Allied reparations bills. It seemed politically more astute to most governments to tell foreign powers instead that Germany's currency problems would only be solved by the abolition of reparations, or at least by rescheduling them to what would be more acceptable levels, to be a more acceptable level. The energy and aggressiveness with which various German governments pursued the dangerous policy varied, and during 1920 and 1921, the slide of the mark against the dollar was arrested more than once. Still, by November of 1921, Germans who wanted to buy a US dollar had to pay 263 marks for it. And by July of 1922, the cost had almost doubled again to 493 marks. Inflation, on this scale, had different effects on different players in the economic game. The ability to borrow money to purchase goods, equipment, industrial plant, and the like, and pay it back when it was worth a fraction of its original value, helped stimulate industrial recovery after the war. In the period up to the middle of 1922, economic growth rates in Germany were high and unemployment low. Without the background of virtually full employment, a general strike, such as the one which frustrated the cap push in March of 1920 would have been far more difficult to mount. Real taxation rates were also low enough to stimulate demand. The German economy managed the transition to a peacetime basis more effectively than some European economies where inflation was less marked. But the recovery was built on sand. For, despite a few temporary respites in the process, the inflation proved to be unstoppable. It took over 1,000 marks to buy a US dollar in August of 1922, 3,000 in October, and 7,000 in December. The process of monetary depreciation was taking on a life of its own. The political consequences were catastrophic. The German government could not make the required reparations payments any longer since they had to be tendered in gold, whose price on the international market it could no longer afford to meet. Moreover, by the end of 1922, it had fallen seriously behind in its deliveries of coal to the French, another part of the reparations program. So French and Belgian troops occupied Germany's leading industrial district, the Ruhr, in January of 1923 in order to seize the missing coal and force the Germans to fulfill their obligations under the treaty. The government in Berlin almost immediately proclaimed a policy of passive resistance and non-cooperation with the French in order to deny the occupiers facilities to garner the fruits of Ruhr industrial production for themselves. The struggle was only called off towards the end of September. Passive resistance made the economic situation worse. Anyone who wanted to buy $1 in January of 1923 had to pay over 17,000 marks for it. In April, 24,000. In July, 353,000. This was hyperinflation on a truly staggering scale, and the dollar rate in marks for the rest of the year is best expressed in numbers that soon became longer than anything found even in a telephone directory. 4,621,000 in August, 98,860,000 in September, 25,260,000,000 in October, 2,193,600,000,000 in November, and 4,200,000,000,000 in December. Newspapers soon began informing their readers about the nomenclature of big numbers, which varied confusingly from one country to another. The French, one columnist noted, called a million a trillion, while for us, on the other hand, a trillion is equal to a million billion. And we must only hope to God that we don't get into these or even higher numerical values with our everyday currency merely because of the overcrowding of the lunatic asylums that it would cause. At its height, the hyperinflation seemed terrifying. Money lost its meaning almost completely. Printing presses were unable to keep up with the need to produce banknotes of ever more astronomical denominations, and municipalities began to print their own emergency money using one side of the paper only. Employees collected their wages in shopping baskets or wheelbarrows, so numerous were the banknotes needed to make up their pay packets, and immediately rushed to the shops to buy supplies before the continuing plunge in the value of money put them out of reach. The school student, Raymond Pretzel, later remembered how at the end of every month his father, a senior civil servant, would collect his salary, rush off to buy a season ticket for the railway so that he could get to work for the next month, send off checks for regular outgoings, take the entire family for a haircut, then hand over what was left to his wife, who would go with the children to the local wholesale market and buy heaps of non-perishable foodstuffs, off which they had to live until the next pay packet came in. For the rest of the month, the family had no money at all. Letters had to be mailed with the latest denomination banknotes stapled to the envelope, since postage stamps of the right value could not be printed fast enough to keep pace with the price rise. The German correspondent of the British Daily Mail reported on July 29, 1923, in the shops the prices are typewritten and posted hourly. For instance, a gramophone at 10 a.m. was 5 million marks, but at 3 p.m. it was 12 million marks. A copy of the Daily Mail purchased on the street yesterday cost 35,000 marks, but today it costs 60,000 marks. The most dramatic and serious effects were on the price of food. A woman sitting down in a cafe might only be able to buy 1 dozen eggs for $4.99. Holy shit. A woman sitting down in a cafe might order a cup of coffee for 5,000 marks and be asked to give the waiter 8,000 for it when she got up to pay an hour later. A kilo of rye bread, the staple of the German daily diet, cost 163 marks on the 3rd of January, 1923, more than 10 times that amount in July, 9 million marks on the 1st of October, 78 billion marks on November 5th, and 233 billion marks a fortnight later, on November 19th. At the height of the hyperinflation, over 90% of the expenditure of an average family went on food. Families on fixed incomes started selling their possessions so that they could have something to eat. Shops began hoarding food in anticipation of immediate price rises. Unable to afford the most basic necessities, crowds began to riot and to loot food shops. Gunfights broke out between gangs of miners who sallied forth into the countryside to strip the fields bare, and the farmers who were trying to protect their crops and were at the same time unwilling to sell them for worthless banknotes. The collapse of the mark made it difficult, if not impossible, to import supplies from abroad. The threat of starvation, particularly in the area occupied by the French, where passive resistance was crippling the transport networks, was very real. Malnutrition caused an immediate rise in deaths from tuberculosis. Not untypical was the experience of the academic Victor Klemperer, whose diaries offer a personal insight into the larger sweep of German history in this period. Living very much from hand to mouth on temporary teaching contracts, Klemperer, a war veteran, was pleased to receive a small additional war gratuity in February of 1920, but, as he complained, what was earlier a small income is now just a tip. See, even in the 1900s they were tipping in Europe. Look at that. Over the following months, Klemperer's diary was increasingly filled with financial calculations as inflation gathered pace. Already in March of 1920, he was encountering foragers, little people with rucksacks, on the train outside Munich. As time went on, Klemperer paid increasingly fantastic bills with a kind of dull fatalism. In 1920, he at last gained a permanent appointment at Dresden Technical University, but it did not bring financial security. Each month, he received an increasingly astronomical salary with back payments to make up for inflation since the last payment. Despite receiving nearly 1 million marks salary at the end of May of 1923, he was still unable to pay his gas and tax bills. Everyone he knew was working out how to make money, speculating on the stock exchange. Even Klemperer had a try, but his first gain, 230,000 marks, paled into insignificance in comparison with that of his colleague, Professor Forster, one of the worst anti-Semites, Teutonic agitators, and patriots in the university, who was said to be making 500,000 marks a day playing the markets. A habitué of cafes, Klemperer paid 12,000 marks for a coffee and cake on the 24th of July. On August 3rd, he noted that a coffee and 3 cakes cost him 104,000 marks. On Monday, August 28th, Klemperer reported that a few weeks previously he had obtained 10 tickets for the cinema, one of his main pleasures in life, for 100,000 marks. Immediately after that, the price increased immeasurably, and most recently, our 10,000 mark seat has already cost 200,000. Yesterday afternoon, he went on, I wanted to buy a new stock. The middle rows of the stalls already cost 300,000 marks, and these were the second cheapest seats in the house. A further price increase had already been announced for the following Thursday, 3 days later. By October 9th, he was reporting, our visit to the cinema yesterday cost 104 million, including the money for the fare. The situation brought him, like many others, to the brink of despair. Germany is collapsing in an eerie, step-by-step manner. The dollar stands at over 800 million. It stands every day at 300 million more than the previous day. All that's not just what you read in the paper, but has an immediate impact on one's own life. How long will we still have something to eat? Where will we next have to tighten our belts? What? Stop scratching my carpet. Motherfucker. Klemperer spent more and more of his time scrambling about for money, writing on November 2nd. Yesterday, I waited for money in the university cashier's office the whole morning, up to almost 2 o'clock, and in the end, I didn't get a penny. Not even what was left from the October payment, since the dollar rose yesterday from 65 to 130 billion. So today, I will have to pay my gas bill and other things at twice yesterday's price. In the case of gas, that is likely to make a difference of a good 150 billion. What are you doing back there? Honey. I know you're up to no good. Stop. Come back here. Come out here. Honey, what are you doing out there? He's meowing. Stop! I know you're just... Stop! 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 He doesn't even like scratching. He just knows it fucks with me. So he'll go back there and let me know he's back there. And then he'll just wait, and then he'll start scratching. He doesn't even like scratching it. Food riots were breaking out in Dresden, he reported, some of them with an anti-Semitic tinge, and Klemperer began to fear that his house would be broken into in the frantic search for supplies. Work was impossible. Money matters take up a very great deal of time and frazzle one's nerves. Germany was grinding to a halt. Businesses and municipalities could no longer afford to pay their workers or buy supplies for public utilities. By September 7th, 60 out of the 90 tram routes in Berlin had stopped running. The situation clearly could not continue any longer. The country was brought back from the brink of a combination of astute political moves and clever financial reforms. Beginning his long period of service as foreign minister in August of 1923, Gustav Stresemann, who combined the office with the Reich chancellorship for the first few months, initiated a policy of fulfillment, negotiating the withdrawal of the French from the Ruhr in September in return for a guarantee that Germany would meet its reparations payments, come what might. As a result, the international community agreed to look again at the reparations system, and a plan drawn up by a committee under the chairmanship of the American financial expert Charles Dawes was negotiated and accepted the following year. The Dawes plan did not hold out any prospect of an end to the payments, but at least it put in place a series of arrangements to ensure that paying them was a practical proposition, and for the next 5 years they were indeed paid without too many problems. Stresemann's policy did not earn him any plaudits from the nationalist right, who resisted any concession to the principle of reparations, but the extent of the hyperinflation by this time convinced most people that this was the only realistic policy, a view they would most probably not have taken a year or so earlier. On the financial front, the Stresemann government appointed Hjalmar Schacht, an astute financier with strong political connections, to head the central state bank, the Reichsbank, on the 22nd of December 1923. A new currency had already been issued on November 15th, the Rentenmark, whose value was tied to the price of gold. Schacht put a number of measures in place to defend the Rentenmark from speculation, and, as a new currency, soon renamed the Reichsmark, became more widely available. It replaced the old one and achieved general acceptance. The hyperinflation was over. How long ago, when did the euro come into play in Germany? How long ago was the currency before the euro? How long has that been? The 90s? 2000? Could you trade out, you must have been able to trade out your, what were they called? Were they still called Reichsmarks or Rentenmarks then? Or Reichsmarks then? It was the Deutschmark before the euro? Oh. Other countries were affected by post-war inflation, but none so badly as Germany. At the height of the hyperinflation, which varied from country to country, prices stood at 14,000 times their pre-war level in Austria, 23,000 times in Hungary, 2.5 million times in Poland, and 4 billion times in Russia, although the inflation here was not strictly comparable to its counterparts elsewhere, since the Bolsheviks had largely withdrawn the Soviet economy from the world market. These rates were bad enough, but in Germany, prices had reached 1 billion times their pre-war level. Wait, was that 4 million? What is 4,000 million times in Russia? What does 4,000 million mean? Is that not 4 billion? Or is that 1,000 a typo? Is this a British thing? It's metric numbers. So does this just mean 4 million? It probably just means 4 million times, I guess. 4,000 million, so 4 million, I guess. Okay. But in Germany, prices have reached 1 billion times their pre-war level, a decline that has entered the annals of economic history as the greatest hyperinflation ever. It was noticeable that all these countries had not fought on the winning side of the war. Each country eventually stabilized its currency without much reference to the others. No viable new international financial system emerged in the 1920s to compare with the elaborate set of institutions and agreements that was to govern international finance after the Second World War. Destiny relevant. Nice. Dead link, retard. The consequences, both of the hyperinflation and of the way it came to an end, were momentous. Yet its long-term effects on the economic situation of Germany's population are hard to measure. It used to be thought that it destroyed the economic prosperity of the middle class. But the middle class was a very diverse group in economic and financial terms. Anyone who had invested money in war bonds or other loans to the state lost it, but anyone who had borrowed a large sum of money as a mortgage for a house or flat was likely to end up acquiring the property for virtually nothing. Often these two situations were united to one degree or another in the same person. Oh, long scale English, short scale German. Oh, weird. Okay, whatever. I don't know. But for those who depended on a fixed income, the results were ruinous. Creditors were embittered. The economic and social cohesion of the middle class was shattered, as winners and losers confronted one another across new social divides. The result was a growing fragmentation of the middle class political parties in the second half of the 1920s, rendering them helpless in the face of demagogic assaults from the far right. And, crucially, as the deflationary effects of the stabilization began to bite, all social groups felt the pinch. Popular memory conflated the effects of the inflation, the hyperinflation, and the stabilization into a single economic catastrophe in which virtually every group in German society was a loser. Victor Klemperer was a typical figure in the process. When the stabilization came, the fear of sudden monetary devaluation, the mad rush of having to shop were over, but destitution came in their place. For in the new currency, Klemperer had virtually nothing of any value and hardly any money at all. After all his speculation, he concluded, gloomily, "My shares have a value of scarcely 100 marks, my cash reserves, at home about the same, and that's all. My life insurance is utterly and completely lost. 150 paper millions are 0.015 pfennigs," whatever that means. As money lost its value, goods became the only thing worth having, and a huge crime wave swept the country. Convictions for theft, which had numbered 115,000 in 1913, peaked at 365,000 in 1923. 7 times more offenders were convicted of handling stolen goods in 1923 than in 1913. So desperate were the poor, even in 1921, that a social democratic newspaper reported that out of 100 men sent to Berlin's Plötzensee prison, 80 had no socks on, 60 were without shoes, and 50 did not even have a shirt on their back. Pilfering on the Hamburg docks, where workers had traditionally helped themselves to a portion of the cargoes they were paid to load and unload, reached unprecedented levels. Workers were said to be refusing to load some goods on the grounds that they could not use any of them. Trade unions reported that many workers only went up to the quayside in order to steal, and that anyone who tried to stop them was beaten up. Coffee, flour, bacon, and sugar were favored booty. In effect, workers were increasingly enforcing payment in kind as money wages declined in value. So widespread did the phenomenon become that some foreign shipping firms began unloading goods elsewhere in 1922 to 1923. A similar economy of theft and barter began to replace money transactions in other trades and other centers as well. Violence, or the threat of violence, sometimes made itself evident in spectacular ways. Gangs of up to 200 heavily armed youths were seen storming barns in the countryside and carrying off the produce. Yet, despite this atmosphere of barely controllable criminality, convictions for wounding fell from 113,000 in 1913 to a mere 35,000 in 1923, and there was a comparable fall in other categories of crime not directly relating to theft. Almost everybody seemed to be concentrating on stealing small amounts of food and supplies in order to stay alive. There were reports of girls selling themselves for packets of butter. Bitterness and resentment of this situation were increased by the feeling that some people were making huge profits from it through illicit currency dealing, cross-border smuggling, profiteering, and the illegal moving of goods. The black marketeer and the profiteer had become objects of denunciation by populist demagogues even before galloping inflation became hyperinflation. Now they became popular hate figures. There was a widespread feeling that profiteers were partying the night away, while honest shopkeepers and artisans were having to sell their household furniture to buy a loaf of bread. traditional moral values appeared to many to be in decline, along with traditional monetary values. The descent into chaos, economic, social, political, and moral, seemed to be total. Money, income, financial solidity, economic order, regularity, and predictability had been at the heart of bourgeois values and bourgeois existence before the war. Now, all this seemed to have been swept away, along with the equally solid-seeming political system of the Wilhelmine Reich. A widespread cynicism began to make itself apparent in Weimar culture, from films like Dr. Mabuse the Gambler to Thomas Mann's The Confessions of the Swindler Felix Kroll, written in 1922, though put aside and not completed until more than 30 years later. It was not least as a consequence of the inflation that Weimar culture developed its fascination with criminals, embezzlers, gamblers, manipulators, thieves, and crooks of all kinds. Life seemed to be a game of chance, survival a matter of the arbitrary impact of incomprehensible economic forces. In such an atmosphere, conspiracy theories began to abound. Gambling, whether at the card table or at the stock exchange, became a metaphor for life. Much of the cynicism that gave Weimar culture its edge in the mid-1920s and made many people eventually long for the return of idealism, self-sacrifice, and patriotic dedication derived from the disorienting effects of the hyperinflation. Hyperinflation became a trauma whose influence affected the behavior of Germans of all classes long afterwards. It added to the feeling in the more conservative sections of the population of a world turned upside down, first by defeat, then by revolution, and now by economics. It destroyed faith in the neutrality of the law as a social regulator between debtors and creditors, rich and poor, and undermined notions of the fairness and equity that the law was supposed to maintain. It debased the language of politics, already driven to hyperbolic overemphasis by the events of 1918 to 1919. It lent new power to stock fantasy images of evil, not just the criminal and the gambler, but also the speculator and, fatefully, the financially manipulative Jew. Among the groups widely regarded as winners in the economic upheaval of the early 1920s were the big industrialists and financiers, a fact that caused widespread resentment against capitalists and profiteers in many quarters of German society. But German businessmen were not so sure that they had gained so much. Many of them looked back on the Wilhelmine Reich with nostalgia, a time when the state, the police, and the courts had kept the labor movement at bay, and business itself had bent the ear of government in key matters of economic and social policy. Misconceived, though this rose-tinted retrovision might have been, the fact remained that big business had indeed held a privileged position before the war, despite occasional irritations with state interference in the economy. The rapidity and scale of Germany's industrialization had not only made the country into mainland Europe's major economic power by 1914, it had also created a business sector that was remarkable for the scale of its enterprises and the public prominence of its managers and entrepreneurs. Men like the arms manufacturer Krupp, the iron and steel magnates Stumm and Thyssen, the ship owner Ballin, the electricity company bosses Rathenau and Siemens, and many more were household names, rich, powerful, and politically influential. Such men tended, with varying emphasis, to resist unionization and reject the idea of collective bargaining. During the war, however, they had softened their antagonism under the impact of growing state interference in labor relations, and on November 15, 1918, business and the unions, represented respectively by Hugo Steins and Karl Liebknecht, signed a pact establishing a new framework of collective bargaining, including recognition of the 8-hour day. Both sides had an interest in warding off the threat of sweeping socialization from the extreme left, and the agreement preserved the existing structure of big business while giving the unions equal representation on a nationwide network of joint bargaining committees. Like other elements of the Wilhelmine establishment, big business accepted the Republic because it seemed the most likely way of warding off something worse. Things did not, then, seem too bad for business during the early years of the Republic. Once they had cottoned on to the fact that the inflation was going to continue, many industrialists purchased large quantities of machinery with borrowed money that had lost its value by the time they came to pay it back. But this did not mean, as some have claimed, that they drove on the inflation because they saw its advantages for themselves. On the contrary, many of them were confused about what to do, above all during the hyperinflation of 1923. and the gains they made from the whole process were not as spectacular as has often been alleged. Moreover, the sharp deflation that was the inevitable outcome of currency stabilization brought serious problems for industry, which had in many cases invested in more plant than it needed. Bankruptcies multiplied, and the huge industrial and financial empire of Hugo Stein's collapsed. Major companies sought refuge in a wave of mergers and cartels, most notably the United Steelworks, formed in 1924 from a number of heavy industrial companies, and the massive IG Farben, the German Die Trust, created the same year from the chemical firms of Agfa, Bass, Bayer, Greichen, Host, and Wellertermeer to form the largest corporation in Europe and the fourth largest in the world after General Motors, United States Steel, and Standard Oil. Mergers and cartels were designed not only to achieve market dominance, but also to cut costs and increase efficiency. The new enterprises set great store by rationalizing their production along the lines of the super-efficient Ford Motor Company in the United States. Fordism, as it was known, automated and mechanized production wherever possible in the interests of efficiency. It was accompanied by a drive to reorganize work in accordance with new American time and motion studies, known as Taylorism, much debated in Germany during the second half of the 1920s. Changes along these lines were achieved to a spectacular degree in the coal mining industry in the Ruhr, where 98% of coal was extracted by manual labor before the war, but only 13% by 1929. The use of pneumatic drills to dig out the coal and of mechanized conveyor belts to take it to the loading point, combined with a reorganization of working practices to bring about an increase of the annual output of coal per miner from 255 tons in 1925 to 386 tons by 1932. Such efficiency gains enabled the mining companies to reduce the size of their labor force very quickly, from 545,000 in 1922 to 409,000 in 1925 and 353,000 in 1929. Similar processes of rationalization and mechanization happened in other areas of the economy, notably in the rapidly growing automobile industry. Yet, in other areas, such as iron and steel production, efficiency gains were achieved not so much by mechanization and modernization as by mergers and monopolies. For all the discussions and debates about Fordism, Taylorism, and the like, much of the German industry still had a very traditional look to it at the end of the 1920s. Adjusting to the new economic situation after stabilization in any case meant retrenchment, cost-cutting, and job losses. The situation was made worse by the fact that the relatively large birth cohorts born in the pre-war years were now coming onto the job market, more than replacing those killed in the war, or by the devastating influenza epidemic that swept the world immediately afterwards. The labor census of 1925 revealed that there were 5 million more people in the available workforce than in 1907. The next census, held in 1931, showed an additional million or more. By the end of 1925, under the twin impacts of rationalization and generational population growth, unemployment had reached 1 million. In March 1926, it topped 3 million. In the new circumstances, business lost its willingness to compromise with the labor unions. Stabilization meant that employers were no longer able to pass on the cost of wage raises by raising their prices. The organized structure of collective bargaining that had been agreed between employers and unions during the First World War fell apart. It was replaced by increasingly acrimonious relations between business and labor, in which labor's room for maneuver became ever more restricted. Yet, employers continued to feel frustrated in their drive to cut costs and improve productivity by the strength of the unions and the legal and institutional obstacles placed in their way by the state. The system of arbitration put in place by the Weimar Republic loaded the dice in favor of the unions during labor disputes, or so the employers felt. When a bitter dispute over wages in the iron and steel industry in the Ruhr was settled by compulsory arbitration in 1928, the employers refused to pay the small wage increase that had been awarded and locked over 200,000 metal workers out of their plants for 4 weeks. The workers were not only backed by the Reich government, led by the Social Democrats in a grand coalition formed earlier in the year, but also got paid relief by the state. To the employers, it began to seem as if the whole structure of the Weimar Republic was ranged against them. Things were made worse from their point of view by the financial obligations that the state placed on them. In order to try and alleviate the worst consequences of the stabilization for workers and to prevent the recurrence of the near collapse of welfare provisions that had occurred during the hyperinflation, the government introduced an elaborate scheme of unemployment insurance in stages in the years 1926 and 1927. Designed to cushion some 17 million workers against the effects of job losses, The most substantial of these laws, passed in 1927, required the same contributions from employers as employees and set up a state fund to cope with major crises when the number of unemployed exceeded the figure with which it was designed to cope. Since this was only 800,000, it was obvious that the scheme would get into serious trouble should numbers go any higher. In fact, they had exceeded the limit even before the scheme came into effect. Not surprisingly, this welfare system represented a growing state intervention in the economy, which business disliked. It piled on extra costs by enforcing employers' contributions to workers' benefit schemes, and it imposed an increasing tax burden on business enterprise and indeed on well-off businessmen themselves. Most hostile of all were the heavy industrialists of the Ruhr. Legal restrictions on hours of work prevented them in many cases from utilizing their plant round the clock. Contributions to the unemployment benefit scheme launched in 1927 were seen as crippling. In 1929, the Industrialists' National Organization announced its view that the country should no longer afford this kind of thing and called for swinging cuts in state expenditure, accompanied by the formal ending of the bargain with labor that had preserved big business at the time of the 1918 revolution. Claims that it was the welfare system, rather than the state of the international economy, that was causing their problems were exaggerated, to say the least. But the new mood of hostility towards the unions and the Social Democrats among many employers in the second half of the 1920s was unmistakable nonetheless. Big business was thus already disillusioned with the Weimar Republic by the late 1920s. The influence it had enjoyed before 1914, still more during the war and the post-war era of inflation, now seemed to be drastically diminished. Moreover, its public standing, once so high, had suffered badly as a result of financial and other scandals that had surfaced during the inflation. People who lost their fortunes in dubious investments searched for someone to blame. Such scapegoating focused in 1924 to 1925 on the figure of Julius Barmit, a Russian Jewish entrepreneur who had collaborated with leading Social Democrats in importing food supplies immediately after the war, then invested the credits he obtained from the Prussian State Bank and the post office in financial speculation during the inflation. When his business collapsed towards the end of 1924, leaving 10 million Reichsmarks of debt, the far right took the opportunity to run a scurrilous press campaign accusing leading Social Democrats such as the former Chancellor Gustav Bauer of taking bribes. Financial scandals of this kind were exploited more generally by the far right to back up claims that Jewish corruption was exerting undue influence on the Weimar state and causing financial ruin to so many ordinary middle-class Germans. What could business do to remedy this situation? Its room for political maneuver was limited. From the beginning of the Republic, business sought both to insulate industry from political interference and to secure political influence, or at least goodwill, through financial donations to the bourgeois parties, notably the Nationalists and the People's Party. Large concerns often had a financial hold on major newspapers through their investments, but this seldom translated into a direct political input. Where the owner did intervene frequently in editorial policy, as in the case of Alfred Hugenberg, whose press and media empire expanded rapidly during the Weimar Republic, this often had little to do with the specific interests of business itself. By the early 1930s, indeed, leading businessmen were so irritated by Hugenberg's right-wing radicalism that they were plotting to oust him from the leadership of the Nationalist Party. Far from speaking with one voice on the issues that affected it, business was split from top to bottom, not only by politics, as the example of Hugenberg suggests, but by economic interest too. Thus, while the Ruhr iron, steel, and mining companies were furiously opposed to the Weimar welfare state and the Weimar system of collective bargaining, companies like Siemens or IG Farben, the giants of the more modern sectors of the economy, were more willing to compromise. Some conflict of interest also existed between export-oriented industries, which did relatively well during the years of stabilization and retrenchment, and industries producing mainly for the home market, which included, once again, the Ruhr iron and steel magnates. Even among the latter, however, there were serious differences of opinion, with Krupp actually opposing the hardline stance taken by the employers in the 1928 lockout. By the end of the 1920s, business was divided in its politics and hemmed in by the restrictions placed on it by the Weimar state. It had lost much of the political influence it had enjoyed during the inflation. Its frustration with the Republic was soon to erupt into open hostility on the part of some of its most influential representatives. Wow. Culture wars is next. Holy shit. Tim Pool was right.